Oh, is that going to cause feedback or something?
No, it's just not the best place.
So, Brad, I'm only going to speak for like 2 minutes. Be ready to take this off of me quickly. Put it on David next here.
Okay. Oh yeah, okay, right here.
And then same thing for Elias. But since we're streaming, put it on quickly. All right, if you want it. Okay. Okay. Can I have everyone's attention? All right. I know, let's get started. I know this is like almost kind of like a big family, but we have a jam-packed agenda, so let's kick it off. Welcome to Social Media Safety in Schools 2018. My name is Jeff Collins. I work at After School. We are the largest teen-focused social network in the US with networks in approximately 85% of US high schools. You're gonna hear a little bit more about our company and its story later today when our CEO, Michael Callahan, speaks at lunch. So we created this event series to inform and connect diverse groups, companies, NGOs, parents, students, schools, who work on specific issues pertaining to young people and who want to help improve the daily lives of young people. And last year for our first conference, we gathered and we talked about the issue of threats made on social media regarding schools. And it was a very successful. This takeaway was that bringing together these diverse groups from police to school principals to teachers to students never really happened. And so we wanted to reprise that and kind of build on it this year. So of course, we're here tackling the critical issue of teen mental health and suicide prevention and how social media can play a role or a more positive role in both of those. And when we started thinking about this event, we were thinking we'd get 25 or so people. It kind of mushroomed, and that was incredibly gratifying. We had 50 people. I think we're about 40 today because we had at least 5 cases of the flu, so make sure you wash your hands. But it's been amazing to see the incredible support of everyone. And as we've planned and organized this event, I've learned a lot, and I've really been inspired by all of you who work on these tough issues on a daily basis. So we do have a very full agenda, so I'm going to end there, and I'm going to introduce our MC for the day, David Ryan Polgar. So a little bit of background about David, and you all have bios. I want you to read them and read all the details about him and our other speakers. But David is one of the most insightful people I have met on issues around technology and its evolution and how it impacts our lives and our society. I met David when he co-founded and led the Digital Citizenship Conference at Twitter. And as I learned more about him, I saw that he had a really multifaceted background, a little similar to mine, which was really neat to learn. So David combines his background as both an attorney and an educator, along with experience working for a number of social media companies to understand and to help others understand the evolving use of technology. So just a few highlights of David's career. I mentioned the Twitter Summit. He is the co-host and co-creator of an amazing, relatively new podcast called Funny as Tech. Please check it out. He is a contributing writer for Quartz, Big Think, Dell Perspective, and IBM Think Leaders. And he's the head of trust and safety for the social networking platform Friendbase. David, we're incredibly thankful that you're here to help us today, and he traveled from the East Coast. So with that, please join me in giving a warm welcome to David Ryan Polgar.
Yeah, the strong introduction though is that I feel like I'm just gonna let everybody down. I don't know if there's been this
put this like
black mirror type of tracker on me. I believe that. Oh, good. Now I can hear the thoughts in my head. Okay, good. This works. So what we're talking about today is social media's role in reducing teen suicide and just the interesting area of this intersection. If you're listening to the news or watching the news, you're seeing this is one of the most debated topics right now. You might have seen that Mark Zuckerberg recently came out and saying, wait a minute, we need to ensure that Facebook is about meaningful interaction, that the time you spend online is time well spent, right? Kind of an ode to this time well spent movement you might have heard about. And that's why I'm excited to be here. As Jeff mentioned, I kind of have this role as a tech ethicist, where I look at the ethical, legal, and emotional impact of social media and technology. But I think what we have today is an opportunity to actually alter the conversation, right? We're all trying, as Steve Jobs said, to put a dent in the universe. Unfortunately, as we saw last year, a lot of people put dents in the universe, but they were not positive dents. We've seen a lot of pushback on Silicon Valley at large for its large potential adverse impact. But at the same time, as we all know, looking around the room, so many people that I already know here are people that I met online, that I met, let's say, through Twitter, or through Facebook, or through other forms of social media, or just email. So we see the potential, and that's why I like to say that social media is like a knife. It can be used to inflict pain, or it can be used to carve a future that is more connected, more just, and more intellectually curious. But what we have to do, since the future is not already written, is we have to have gatherings like today, right, which can have that impact. So that's why we're bringing together a diverse mix of mental health professionals, students, thought leaders, social media companies, to actually say, okay, what are the actual solutions here? And that's why we're not just about talking heads. So this is where everybody today, when you're having an idea, because again, somebody's got to come up with these solutions. When you have an idea, if you look behind you, kind of on the right-hand side, there we have pieces of paper or index types of cards where you can put on, if you look on the left side, the solutions board. Because we wouldn't consider today a success if we just end up talking about something, right? Talk is cheap. We want to talk about it. We want to bring that awareness, but also come up with action-oriented solutions. And that's why I'm really excited about some of the guests that we have coming up. Also wanted to remind everybody to, since this is social media, we want to use our hashtag. The hashtag is hashtag SMSS 2018, right? SMSS 2018. So that's what we're trying to do, right? Take pictures, share quotes, anything that you want to add to it, or anything that you thought was worthwhile, please mention, put it online. I think we're all okay with that. And that's why we're also having this event live stream, because as excited we are to have this audience here, there's also an audience all throughout the nation, all throughout the globe, that is actively thinking about this issue. Because I think that's the larger point, and then we'll bring up our first speaker, is that we need to start thinking about social media and technology in a very agnostic manner. It's neither good nor bad, yet most media attention is social media good for you or is it bad for you? Well, that's like saying, is a tool good for you, or is it bad for you? A hammer is great when I'm using it for a nail, but it's bad if I hit my neighbor with it, right? And we've seen, from an analogy, we've seen the same type of activity happen with social media. We've seen its great ability to connect people, to do Kickstarter, GoFundMe campaigns, but then we've also seen bullying, right? We've seen even this new topic of self-cyberbullying, or self-digital harm, as they would call it. And that's this unusual type of self-cyberbullying, which research has found is done in 6% of cases. So that's why we bring together this type of thought leadership as we have today, because this is not always explored, and it's really kind of up to us. So that's what I'm excited about. So our first speaker is going to be Dr. Elias Aboujad. So Dr. Aboujad is a Stanford University psychiatrist and the author of Virtually You, The Dangerous Powers of the E-Personality. His work explored OCD, impulse control disorders, and the intersection of psychology and technology, focusing both on the negative aspects and the potential benefits, hence why we have him here today. His research and writings have been widely covered, including the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Washington Post. Please help me welcome Dr. Elias Aboujad. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, David, for the question. Thank you, Jeff, for the invitation, and thank you, Erica Plavin, for introducing me to Crafting School. So I titled my talk, where's the introductory slide? There we go. internet aggression, online problems, and online solutions, precisely because of the point David was making, which is that we are often, especially in mental health and mental health research, very siloed. We either study negative aspects of social media and internet-related technologies, or we study solutions. You either study cyberbullying or you study mobile psychotherapy apps. And very few people actually try to look at the angle from a research perspective, at the problem from a research perspective from both angles. And that's absolutely crucial, and that's what drew me to this gathering today. So not that long ago, websites were seen as simply, hosting or distributing places. So whatever users posted online was not the responsibility of the website owner. Websites were protected by the Communications Decency Act from 1996, which basically immunized them against what users of these websites posted on blogs, social networks, etc. So if somebody was the victim of defamation, misinformation, privacy invasion, sexual predation, cyberbullying, you name it, websites enjoyed a great amount of protection. And in general, there was this very sort of laissez-faire attitude toward the internet. Less intervention is better, because more intervention is gonna, squash this, revolution that's taking place and all the wonderful opportunities that it was bringing with it. Well, it took a while, but things have changed, and they have changed in a good way. As users now, we have more nuanced views of what technology brings, both the good and the bad. We went from assuming that technology and internet revolution was bringing this perfect democracy, right? Athens without slaves, to really questioning the negative, potential negative effects on democracy itself of some of what the internet has brought. Similarly, regulatory bodies are much more active in trying to tame some of the downsides that have come with this technology. An example I like to talk about is European Union's right to be forgotten. So an element of your biography that's 30 years old, that's completely irrelevant, but somehow still preventing you from finding a job, does it really have to be there? Or do you, as a human being, enjoy a fundamental right to privacy? Well, the European Union thinks so. Businesses are starting to express a desire to do the right thing, to be good citizens. And the recent announcement by Facebook about modifying the newsfeed algorithm is very much a step in that direction. So this is a healthier place to be in terms of how we consume technology and how we relate to technology. These this awakening at the personal level, at the business level, at the regulatory government level is a good thing. And it's a good thing because we have 2 decades worth of research now, research into similarities between overuse of internet-related technologies and other types of addiction, research into soaring rates of attention deficit, research into some of the aggressive impulses that happen online. And this research body really dictates that we consume these technologies with more responsibility and self-awareness. Unfortunately, virtual interactions can nurture some negative personality traits, and this is why I subtitled my book, The Dangerous Powers of the E-Personality. Some negative aspects of our personalities come out across virtual platforms, including narcissism, impulsivity, regression, aggression, etc. And these personality traits don't stay online. Instead, they seep into offline life, transforming us and transforming our culture at large into something more similar to avatars. Society ends up looking basically like an unregulated messaging blog. And that's not necessarily a good thing. So why do these personality traits come out on virtual platforms? Well, there's of course anonymity. If you're hidden behind this veil of anonymity, then you're more likely to allow yourself to express yourself in ways that are less than noble, less than civilized, less than polite. But that's not the entire answer. A lot of our interactions our emails, our texts, they carry our signature, our name, or our phone number, and yet they're not as proper as maybe they should be. Another reason for this is invisibility. Even if the person knows who you are, the fact that they can't see you face to face, again, allows for these traits to come out more easily. If you think back to the old psychiatric school of psychoanalysis, the analyst would always sit behind the patient. And why is that? There's no eye contact. And if there isn't eye contact, the patient is much more comfortable opening up about taboos and instincts and dark desires, etc. Lack of hierarchy. I talked about how the internet was seen as a perfect democracy, and that's in a sense true, for better or worse. We're all equal and equal to the speed of our modem, and without built-in hierarchies between parent and child, between teacher and student, again, we allow ourselves to express ourselves in ways that are less regulated and more disinhibited. So several factors contribute to this kind of e-personality surfacing, and it recalls what Sigmund Freud wrote about over a century ago in his kind of theory of personality, the id, that dark, inaccessible part of our personality, a chaos, a cauldron of seething excitation, undisciplined, etc. So we may have killed off Freud too soon in psychiatry, because a lot of his theories have found kind of a expression in this new medium. Now, his solution was for the child to incorporate a superego, this voice of authority that helps the child self-regulate, that helps him or her develop morality and a sense of right and wrong. Well, if you look at many of our unregulated online platforms, there's really no deference, no concern for authority, rules, or manners very often. And again, recalls what Freud had to say about the id. And for Freud, this would be a threat to civilization itself. The problem before us is how to get rid of the greatest hindrance to civilization, namely the constitutional inclination of human beings to be aggressive toward one another. These are built-in instincts. According to Freud, much of civilization is about kind of controlling them and allowing them to have outlets that are healthier. And somehow a lot of the platforms that we see online represent kind of a shortcut to this id, allowing it to resurface in all its glory. Of course, I cannot come up with a comprehensive list of online aggressive expression, but there are there are expressions at the level of the state, at the level of society, and of course at the level of the individual. NATO, as of last couple of years ago, made cyber warfare a new formal arena for war operations, besides the old land, air, and sea. Socially, I think all you have to do is look at political discourse in this country, both offline and the online and the offline consequences of that, to see how easy it is for people to radicalize, become polarized, splinter online, and that's ironic given kind of the global village that the internet was supposed to be. Also, all sorts of access to ways for misbehaving. As an educator, I deal with this all the time. People cutting and pasting their homework or papers that they have to write. Now, this is not there's nothing new about that, but the fact that it's become so much easier and access has become so much more automatic has real life consequences. Of course, cyberbullying, flaming, trolling on the more personal level, all these are expressions of this aggression that comes out so automatically and so naturally online. And finally, of course, suicide, which, to go back to the psychoanalytic tradition was referred to as aggression against the self, aggression turned inward. And our threshold for hurting others changes online. It becomes lower, and so maybe our threshold to hurt ourselves. And I'll talk more about this. So why should this matter? Why should we care? Well, virtual violence, does not stay there. And it might be more worrisome than other forms of media violence. When novels first came around, people thought they would spell the end of civilization. Similar with the radio, movies, etc. But the internet may be different in that it's much more interactive. It talks back to you, it rewards you, it punishes you. You're not a passive recipient of the online experience. You're very much an active participant, and for this reason, if you think, for example, at VR video games, for this reason, it's easier to confuse with real life, and easier to import some of these issues into real life. There's some intriguing research, certainly needs to be replicated and has been challenged in other studies, but enough of a red flag to be worth mentioning, which is what happens when kids are exposed to habitual violence through violent video games. One study that I find interesting looked at over 15,000 subjects taken from the US and Japan, so two very different cultures with very different kind of thresholds and relationships to violence, and assessed them twice during the school year. And what they saw was that habitual players of violent virtual games were twice as likely to be aggressive offline later in that year, and that those results held when corrected for gender and for baseline aggression, and they were similar in magnitude in those two very different cultures. Again, more research is needed, but enough of a red flag to for us to be concerned. Cyberbullying, of course, is another example of all too common online aggression. Has been given several other names as well, cyber stalking, etc. And the definition that I like to use and that I've used in my work is any behavior performed through electronics, it has to be electronic to be cyber, or digital media by individuals or groups that repeatedly, for it to be bullying, there has to be repetition. So repeatedly communicates hostile or aggressive messages intended to harm someone or produce discomfort. So there has to be intent as well. And it's an example of kind of bullying on steroids in a sense. So an example of an old form of aggression, of violence that has been transformed in kind of a worse way via these technologies. So how does it compare with traditional bullying? The cyberbully is unknown often. So if you're the victim, you're not sure who to protect yourself against. Cyberbullying can happen around the clock, so it's no longer limited to the bus or the schoolyard. Kids are very reluctant, in my experience, to complain about cyberbullying because the last thing they want to see is for their electronics to be taken away or their time online to be curtailed. This is fascinating to me. It's easier for the victim of cyberbullying to become a bully himself or herself. There isn't as much need for physical power or strength or any of that. I've discussed this in other groups, and some kids see it as empowering, and I think I can see why they see it that way, but at the same time, it's a sad commentary on our culture that the only way we can protect ourselves from a situation like this is to bully back. And there's the fact that the evidence or the attack stays online forever waiting to be Googled. And there's a record of these attacks that stays with the individual way beyond their school age year. And in extreme examples, of course, they can go viral. So the statistics are pretty scary. 20 to 40% of children and adolescents, females and sexual minorities are at higher risk. Perpetrators are more likely to be male, although not by a huge percentage. Talked about the bully victim phenomenon, and of course the link to suicide. And I'll use this as a jumping board to discussing suicide in more detail. There's some very scary statistics that came out just last year covering the period from 1999 to 2014. And according to the CDC, so the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the rates of suicide climbed 24%. And this was accurate across all age groups, but also in both males and females. The largest increase happened in girls aged 10 to 14. So many, so pretty stark and scary statistic for which many reasons have been offered, including warnings on the use of antidepressants that have led doctors to prescribe antidepressants less frequently to many adolescents and children who may have depression and may be at risk for suicide. Other psychosocial stressors, if you look at this period, this coincides, at least the second half of it coincides with a Great Recession and a lot of psychosocial turmoil as a result of that, etc. So many reasons have been put forward, but there also might be a link to the internet and how big a role the internet is playing in reconfiguring the suicide landscape. There's really been a complete redrawing, I think, of this landscape. So much so that what we learn about suicide now is different from when I trained as a psychiatrist not that long ago. So if you go online, this has been researched. If you look at my review, you can find more details on this. But there are pro-suicide websites that can either provide foolproof recipes for old, well-known methods on how to end your life, or teach new obscure methods that in the old days required, months and years of research and dusty books and libraries. All you have to do is go online. But there's also the phenomenon of suicide pacts, where individuals who don't know one another, often living in different communities, different countries, choose to end their lives together. There's the performative aspect of live suicides that we're reading about. There's cyberbullying that we talked about and its connection. Also more isolation. Are we becoming more isolated because of our time with electronics? As a result, perhaps more depressed and less supported, and maybe more at risk for suicide. When I trained, they would always teach us to ask patients if they have access to weapons. That was like the must-ask question for anyone at risk for suicide. And we certainly still ask that. But before I asked that, I asked my patients if they've been Googling suicide lately, because this has been kind of like the gateway for many suicides, unfortunately. However, these technologies are here to stay. No one wants to go to live life before Google or wants to turn the clock or thinks they can turn the clock. So these technologies are here to stay. We are all addicted, and logging off is not an option. So it's imperative to find ways to use them in healthy and responsible ways. We must leverage technology to solve technology-related problems. So if you focus on suicide specifically, Facebook in 2011 partnered with the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. So now suicidal comments voiced or expressed on Facebook, can be reported, and Facebook reaches out to the person and connects them with the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. Twitter has a similar approach, a team devoted to handling threats of self-harm or suicide. Instagram, Snapchat, and you'll be hearing more about what After School does as well. So these interventions have been studied to some degree, not as much as they should be, but to some degree, and they have been found to be feasible, meaning doable from a technical standpoint, certainly, but also as part of normal online discourse. They have been shown to be safe. What still requires more work and more research is really determine how efficacious they are. And again, for something that has transformed our lives so radically and in every possible way, the internet and internet-related technologies have not received the kind of mental health research that they deserve to receive. And this is one area where research is still lacking. And I take this opportunity to call for more research and insist on more research, and ask you to insist through your voices on that. And when we talk about using technologies that are here to stay, that we are all hooked on in positive ways, I have to talk about telepsychiatry, a big and growing field. Silicon Valley being one of the poles that are very active on this front now. So using technology as a tool to improve mental health and treat mental illness. So there are software-based interventions now that if you have obsessive compulsive disorder with a particular fear, let's say a contamination obsession, there's an online program that you can go through that does not involve a therapist, that can help expose you and desensitize you to some of these fears. There's video-based therapy that you can use, so that if you live in rural California and don't have access to an eating disorders specialist, let's say, you can now connect with one using some of these new technologies. There are mobile apps, including mobile anti-suicide apps that you're going to be hearing about during this conference. Cognitive training, people with early dementia, what we call mild cognitive impairment. Interesting research on how technology can be used to improve their memory and protect them against potentially against Alzheimer's and illnesses of that nature. Artificial intelligence is hot now and receiving more attention, as is virtual reality therapy. And I'll just show you a couple of slides specifically on virtual reality therapy, because it's a great example of taking something that can be very problematic as a violent VR game, and using it, turning it around and using it as a mental health tool. So exposure, that using virtual reality to 3D environments that are convincing, that are immersive, and that can desensitize the person to their fear, whether it's fear of flying, fear of bridges, fear of tunnels, you name it. Cost is no longer a big impediment, as these technologies have become cheaper, and technical know-how is no longer a big impediment either. Most of the data in virtual reality therapy is from the field of anxiety, whether it's OCD or other types of specific anxieties. But there's interesting data from other areas, including addiction. So if somebody is at a high risk for relapsing after they see particular cues, then they can be desensitized to that through virtual reality with the help of a therapist. Or the body distortion that can happen. Eating disorder, again, has been targeted by eating disorders. So this is what a virtual reality session might look like in a therapist's office. This is the software from Limbic specifically that desensitizes people to phobia against driving on bridges. This is the Golden Gate Bridge, as you will recognize, or fear of flying. So very realistic depictions of common scenarios that can be targeted through telepsychiatry and virtual reality therapy. So this brings me to the end of my talk. We covered a lot in a very short period of time. I thank you for your attention. I'll be around afterwards for questions. So I don't want to cut into anybody else's time. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Go ahead and push you back up here. This thing's a pain. There we go.
Oh, sure. All right, so thank you again, Elias. Really good, thought-provoking kind of opportunity to discuss, but we'll move it right along. But there is the opportunity during lunch and then after to think about a lot of these issues. And again, as a reminder, start thinking of those solutions and then add them to the solutions board. But moving right along, our next speaker is Jonathan Frasiri. He's a child and adolescent therapist who currently is principal at Lydian Academy, adjunct faculty member at the University of San Francisco. Lydian Academy is a one-of-a-kind school dedicated to engaging students in their own education and welcoming them to a warm, accepting learning atmosphere. Previously, Frasiri was the mental health and wellness coordinator at Palo Alto High School. Frasiri's clinical areas of specialization include working with complicated bereavement, trauma, and addictions, as well as postvention, support for schools and organizations in the wake of death or suicide. His consulting work includes collaboration with Palo Alto Unified School District, Herd Alliance, Stanford University, Project Safety Net, and the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention in creating the PAWS Comprehensive Suicide Prevention Toolkits Postvention section. So we thank Jonathan for joining us today. We look forward to understanding more about how a school's approach to issues related to mental health and teen suicide prevention will work. So please give Jonathan a warm welcome.
Yes. Thank you. It's really an honor to be here. I want to start off by saying how humbling it is to be able to speak on this topic. This is a huge topic. What are schools doing in this area of teen suicide prevention? And what you're going to hear from me today is really my observations in the evolution of my career. My career started in the field of death and dying. And I don't mean with respect to suicide. I worked for a grief organization in 2010 called CARA, based in Palo Alto. And my work there began supporting children who had lost parents, parent groups where they had lost small children, working with people at the end of life, so hospice work. And it was in that role that I was an outreach and crisis response director for the agency. And that was also around the time, and we'll get into the timeline, when the first suicide cluster in the Palo Alto community hit 2009, 2010. And so we started going out to the schools at that time to support teachers and staff and students. And so it's kind of going to be a series of snapshots of my story, starting in the mental health field as a clinician, but then going into the schools and becoming an educator. And really, I think that's important because the work that's happening in the schools now is really so much a blend and intersection of mental health and education and community partnership. And so it's an honor to be here. I'm humbled. There's so many experts in the room and educators. So I will do my best to speak to this. You know, I want to start by saying I'm going to be talking about some higher level systems and programs that have been happening in the schools, but I also think it's important to hold the space around these topics because there are individuals in the room statistically who have been impacted by suicide. And if not suicide, certainly by loss. Loss is a natural part of our human life cycle. We're all going to experience it at some point. But with suicide in particular, there are these ripple effects that go through a community and go through families. And I just want to be sensitive to that as I'm going through talking about maybe more objective and concrete things. And also, you know, there's no single cause, there's no single solution to teen suicide in particular. There was, we would have figured it out. Come on, we're in the Silicon Valley, right? The hub of creativity and innovation. It's a complex issue. And so just to pay homage to that, there's complexity around this. And, you know, while I think that one of the aims of this conference is to innovate and think about where we're going in this field and the blend of industry and media and mental health and education, also to applaud what's already been done, right? There has been a groundswell in this area, and to not forget kind of the programs, the initiatives, the partnerships and community coalitions that have formed to address this really important topic. And again, the layered issues and challenges, I guess, not to fall into dualistic thinking or absolutes. You know, it's easy to say, well, the schools shouldn't, you know, give students so much homework, or parents should do a better job, or the media is good or it's bad. You know, it's easy to fall into this sort of duality. I think it's a human tendency. We want to put the blame somewhere. We want to figure out what the reason is, but it's much more complicated than that. And so it's good that everyone is coming together and we're starting a dialogue, you know, between these different stakeholder groups. You know, so I'm going to be talking about, again, my story in Palo Alto to the current day and how it started for me, and giving you that lens, but also highlighting those community response efforts and the collaboration that has occurred. There's people here today from Stanford and Children's Health Council and my Digital TAT2, students, teachers from the Palo Alto School District. All these people deserve applause, and they've really all been an integral part of this. So this is really the arc of my own experience with this teen suicide prevention movement. I didn't start in 2009, 2010 for this talk because that's when the first cluster hit. It's because that's when I started working in Palo Alto. But you know, coincidentally, that is when the first cluster occurred. And at that time, we lost 5 people in 2009, 2010, young persons in an 8-month span, starting in May of 2009. And at the time I was working at CARA, the grief organization I mentioned. And in my response and my team's response going out to the schools at that time, I think one of the first things we gleaned from the experience was there was a need for students and teachers and community members to grieve, but there was fear around contagion, right? There was fear that if we talk about suicide, if we mention the S word, we're going to contribute to more young people dying. And so a lot of times, you know, going out to the schools, we would see that schools were kind of shutting down the conversations. And I don't say this in a judgmental way, just observing. I think there was so much fear, you know, like, how do we support grieving? How do we support conversation without contributing to more young people losing their lives? And so we knew there was a need for there to be shared best practices. What do we do when spontaneous memorials pop up on a school campus because kids are wanting to grieve and remember their friend that they lost? How do we respond the day after we get the news, or the week after? You know, what are those postvention responses supposed to look like to really follow best practice? And also, do we have enough mental health staffing in the schools? You know, are we appropriately supporting teachers and students? Along the same lines, I was just starting to get involved in a community coalition that was starting to mobilize in Palo Alto. It was really a grassroots endeavor. City officials, the school district, the Healthcare Alliance in response to adolescent depression, called the HERD Alliance. The county was beginning a suicide prevention task force at that time. All of these groups, and Caltrain, because a number of our young people lost their lives by Caltrain, they all started coming together and mobilizing and wanting to figure this out. Let's problem solve, let's work together. These initial groups decided to keep meeting, and they formed a formal community task force called Project Safety Net. CARA was a part of Project Safety Net. Even though we were strictly postvention, we go out after something has already happened. We knew that we needed to be a part of prevention and intervention, and that postvention was an inextricable link in that process. A really good colleague of mine and professor at Stanford Department of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, Shashank Yoshi, he's a co-founder of the HERD Alliance, and he would always talk about how suicide prevention is a 3-legged stool. You have the mental health promotion piece, right? Raising awareness and talking about mental health. Intervention in the crisis. How do we respond to teens that are at risk? How do we get them the help they need? And then postvention, when we do lose someone, how we respond in a responsible and best practice sort of way actually informs further prevention if we do it right, right? It can be preventative in and of itself. So these things are all linked together. And so Project Safety Net really embodied that we're bringing all these different groups together to take a stab at this. At the same time, there were meetings that were starting to happen with the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention representatives and PSN, with the local papers and the local media, because part of what the fear was at the time was that the way stories were being reported on when we were losing young people, may not be adhering to best practice guidelines for how to report. Things like front page articles with the headline suicide on the front, or details about the person that died and maybe their photo, and what they would say now, more sensationalized reporting. I don't think we knew as much then, we were starting to. And so these meetings started to happen because we wanted to bring the media in as part of the solution. That was really important as an objective. At this time, I started a private practice in Palo Alto. I was working with teens and young people, and I began to hear through the grapevine that there was this really cool program at Gunn High School that started up after this cluster year called Sources of Strength. And I put it on here today because it's a really important program in the sense that, yes, it's on SAMHSA's top 5 registry for evidence-based prevention programs. But what Sources of Strength is really, what's really great about it is it brings student peer leaders and trusted adults together on a school campus to spread messages of hope, help, and strength. The worry around contagion is that the stories we tell are contributing to a certain narrative, right? And that narrative in a way contributes to more people being at risk, or if they're already at risk, making them more vulnerable. And so Sources wasn't about being Pollyanna-ish in our responses to this crisis, but it was taking stories that students were willing to share and teachers were willing to share, and doing these messaging campaigns through social media, through print journalism at the schools about how they were overcoming adversity, right? We all have adversity in our lives. How do we overcome it? How do we bounce back? And so it was about reshaping the narrative. And it comes from public health theory, because there's this idea that negative beliefs and values and behaviors can permeate a social network. That's what we think of as suicide contagion, the word contagion. But contagion is really a neutral word. It doesn't have to be negative. So Sources of Strength would talk about how we can have a contagion of hope, or we can have an epidemic of strength. And it's all about how we use those social networks and get those messages out there that really permeates and has that influence. Another major assumption of Sources was that adolescents reference their peers more than any other group developmentally. Our youth survey data in these years following the first cluster, and actually more recently from like the California Healthy Kids surveys and other data pools that we collected, really validates this. Our students were telling us that yes, they reference their peers more. They would be more likely to go talk to a peer than they might be to go talk to an adult. So this program was really important, and I think really vital in kickstarting this movement in the schools. At the same time, there were a number of folks from Stanford, the schools, American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. I was a part of this with my role at CARA because these folks wanted to put together a guideline or a roadmap for schools. How do schools respond not only to suicide that's occurred, but how do they promote mental health? How do they intervene when there's a crisis? And so this was looking at the 3 legs of the stool. And the first iteration of the toolkit was published in 2013. And school staff were trained in the toolkit and postvention response and intervention response. And that was a really important measure as well at the time. I'm not going to go through all these because I want to be mindful of time, but there were so many other programs that were starting to happen at the schools. Peer-to-peer support. I've done high school a program called ROCK, Reach Out, Care, Know, where students were trained to be rocks for their peers, sort of akin to a peer counseling model with an advisor overseeing the program. Gatekeeper trainings, QPR, it's sort of like CPR is not just for doctors. We can all get trained in CPR. The idea is that QPR can be for anybody. How do you ask somebody the question if they're at risk for suicide? How do you persuade them to get help and refer them to get help? There were more therapists being employed by the schools in-house, not contracting out all of our services. And then again, with the media, Project Safety Net in 2013 met with reps from Facebook and Yahoo, and Larry Magid is here today, I believe. Yes, I believe you were a part of one of these meetings, Larry, with this group of folks. And they talked about actions, that social media could take to actually contribute to suicide prevention. Things like having the NSPL lifeline visible and accessible, or having a get help button for people to use when they were in danger, when they were online. The second cluster hit in 2014, 2015. This was also the time when I started working in the schools. So I took a job at Palo Alto High School in 2014, and we lost 4 more students that year. Between Palo Alto High School and Gunn High School, we had 4 more suicides. And it was in the spring of that year, 2015, that the Board of Education in Palo Alto said, you know what, we need to get more upstream. Our principals were really advocating for this. We need more clinicians that aren't just going to be there to react and put fires out, but we need to look at other programs and initiatives and prevention efforts that are going to reach all of our students. Sources of Strength came to Palo, just like it was a gun. Bring Change to Mind, another great organization. That's the year they got into the schools and started doing their work around reducing stigma around mental health. Many of our clinicians and psychologists began using apps like My3 and other safety plan apps when we were working with at-risk students. And also really critical this year in 2015, the city, the schools, a lot of these folks came together and they actually made a request to the County of Santa Clara that we enlist the CDC's support in coming out to do an EpiAID study of Santa Clara County, an epidemiological study of suicide contagion in our county. There was a precedent for this. Fairfax County in Virginia had just been going through their EpiAID. They had also had a suicide cluster of young people. And really why it's important is this idea that the CDC usually does EpiAIDs for outbreaks, right? Communicable diseases that are spreading. And so the idea that a contagion, suicide's not a communicable disease in the sense that I can sneeze and you catch it from me. But there is this fact, we know this to be true, that contagion is real, right? That we know values and ideas and beliefs can spread through a network. And so the CDC started doing these EpiAIDs in Fairfax, and they agreed to come out to Santa Clara County and do one with us as well. Just full transparency, some of the challenges, these were awesome, these things that were happening. There was an article released in December of 2015 called the Silicon Valley Suicides. It was challenging, the timing of the release of that article, because we were in the 1-year anniversary period of losing the 4 students from the year before. And also the EpiAID team was set to come out in February of 2016. So there's already a lot of attention on suicide in Palo Alto and what's wrong with this community. And, you know, I think the article took a lot of criticism in terms of not following all the guidelines, but I think, you know, more than that, the timing was just really challenging, especially around the holidays. And we know that the holidays can be challenging for folks who've lost people, especially. You know, there was a lot of EpiAID attention in the media. This is getting ahead a little bit, but 13 Reasons Why, the Netflix series that aired in 2016. You know, all of these things, I would say the pros, they started conversation, right? A lot of conversation. Like even students were now really speaking up and saying, you know, we have strong opinions and feelings about articles or Netflix series that are coming out. And so in a way that was a good thing because it was bringing attention to it. But I also think coming out of the second cluster, there was still that fear, you know, are we increasing risk for those who are already at risk? In September of 2015, an epidemiologist named Madeline Gould came out to Palo Alto, and she gave a very impactful presentation. There were people there from the media, there were students there from Palo Alto High School and Gunn High School, teachers, medical professionals, and what she was talking about was, she talked about suicide prevention, but she was really focusing on this notion of changing the narrative. How are we creating a narrative around this in our community? And after this talk, there's an amazing woman at Gunn High School. I have to shout out to Christy Blackburn, the Oracle advisor. The Oracle is a student publication at Gunn High School. And they actually started a series called Changing the Narrative. The web link is up here. If you have a chance to check out Changing the Narrative, I highly recommend it. But what Changing the Narrative has done is monthly, they will release stories by students and staff members talking about adversities that they faced. It might be, you know, suicidal ideation, maybe it was an eating disorder or living with domestic violence, but not focusing in on the details of the trauma or the adversity, but really doing an arc of the story so that the readers were hearing how they overcame that adversity, how they were resilient and bounced back from that adversity. And so really, again, spreading messages of hope, but in a very real way. Madeline Gould talked about helpful and not helpful things that she saw in the media in terms of how things were being presented around suicide. I won't go into reading the bullets, but you can see them here. The EpiAID did something similarly. This actually is data based on a qualitative analysis of 246 news articles that the CDC researched when they came out to Palo Alto and Santa Clara County between the years of 2009 and 2015. So 246 news articles. And what they found was there were some positive characteristics in terms of the reporting, but on average, there was only 0.5 of the positive characteristics per article. And they also saw there were negative characteristics in the reporting, and there were many more. There were about 4.3 per article. And so, you know, again, not about a blaming kind of a thing, but just looking at, there's still more work to be done, right? There's still more work to be done in this area. Getting more current, I'm almost done, I promise. In 2016, both of the high schools opened up wellness centers, which was really pivotal in terms of destigmatizing mental health, because it was now a place where students could go to see a nurse and get an ice pack, or go see a mental health therapist, or have meetings with students to talk about, student wellness efforts on campus. So really reducing stigma around students accessing services. Children's Health Council, a nonprofit in Palo Alto, kicked off a teen mental health initiative and actually started an intensive outpatient program for teens in Palo Alto, which was something we never had before. Teens would have to commute to the South Bay or go up to San Mateo to access intensive services. So they really filled a need in the community. And along with that, California, with this Assembly Bill 2246, many of you may have heard of this bill, we became the first state in the nation to adopt a suicide prevention policy for schools. So that was really groundbreaking as well. The toolkit I mentioned earlier, version 2, has recently been released, Christine, yes? Yeah. 2017. So this new toolkit is going to be a tool that schools can use to actually implement AB 2246 in their school districts. SEL committees have started to convene. So there's been a lot of work. And, I guess my take home, this slide, like you might read some things on here and might think, oh, well, mindfulness is not suicide prevention. Why did he put it on the slide? Or SEL is not, that doesn't have to do with suicide prevention. These all have to do with suicide prevention, right? Because it's not just about responding in the moment, getting people to the hospital, or providing intensive mental health services. That is a part of it. I'm not trying to downplay that. I'm a clinician, right? That's important. But we also need to get upstream and think about, are we getting in there and doing alcohol and other drug work with our peers? Are we doing social emotional learning and mindfulness in schools, and really thinking about ways to bolster protective factors in our students? This is my last slide. What do we know to be true? This is just my observations again, going through this arc. Suicide is a layered, complex issue, right? It's not simple, and we all need to work together. And my hope would be that we could enlist media as our partners, and social media and industry, because we really need you at the table. We need you there with us, because it is the way of the future, as Elias said. It's not going anywhere. And then, this idea that contagion is real, so let's leverage it in the direction of good, right? Let's spread messages of hope and strength. And lastly, we need to bring the students into the mix, because it's their voice, they really have the most power to change these cultural norms around mental health and suicide. Thank you. I've probably gone over by a couple minutes, but I really appreciate you listening.
All right, thank you, Jonathan. And then actually, I just want to send out a reminder that all 3 of our speakers, including the one coming up, they're going to be available for a little bit of Q&A. We're going to have 10 minutes after this talk right here. In addition, as another reminder, don't forget to start thinking of questions for the solution board, and then also our hashtag. And again, that's hashtag SMSS 2018. And then I think some related ones would be hashtag DigSid, hashtag I can help, and a few other ones, Digital for Good. So I'm also going to use this time to have a dismissal of Matt Soeth from I Can Help. Matt, who many of you here probably know, he is going to be leading a breakout session for students. So he's going to be doing that right now. But I'm going to be bringing up Christabel, and she's from the University of Oregon. They have their suicide prevention program that she's going to be talking about. We're going to be learning about their innovative approach to suicide prevention and some of their work they've been doing with the state governmental system. As a side note, I actually connected with Christabel about this event through an online post that I had. So I think at the top of this, we discussed the good, the bad of social media as a tool. So I think that would be, we can throw that in the good. Of how sometimes we can use social media to come together. So Christabel is a doctoral student in the Department of Counseling, Psychology, and Human Services in the Prevention Science program, and has graduate training in special education and school psychology. So please welcome Christabel.
And the students can all head out, follow Matt upstairs. We'll come bring you guys back. And yeah, just as David said, if Elias is still here, we'll have some time for you guys to all ask questions to the 3 speakers at once.
So start thinking of some good ideas. Again, questions and potential solutions. So come on up.
Thank you so
Nice to
much
see
for
you.
nice to meet you.
Yeah.
And thank you all so much for being here. This is so exciting. Oh, yes.
There you go.
Thank you very much. Okay, wow, this is the smallest clicker I've ever seen. Cool. Oh, this is not for. Ah. Is there a clicker?
Yes.
Ah, great.
Got a lot of devices
Okay.
there.
Whew. All right, I am deviced up. So, good afternoon. My name is Christabel Moore. I am here representing the University of Oregon. Go Ducks. Somebody threw me an O earlier. I was super excited to see that. I am here and I'm going to give you a brief, very quick and dirty overview of the research that we're doing at the university in different capacities. So I'm a prevention science doctoral student. It is a new program at the university. There's actually only 3 programs in the country. And prevention science is similar to public health, but in essence, we can apply this sort of framework to just about any health, behavior, or academic outcome. So in particular, I study suicide prevention, and I'm also interested in mindfulness. I was very excited to hear that come up. So just a moment. No? No? Oh, I think we got something. Yes. Okay. So again, very quickly, an overview. I'm going to first talk about my lab, not my lab, my advisor's lab, Dr. John Seeley, the lab that I work in. And then I'm going to talk about the collaboration with the Center for Digital Mental Health and the exciting work that's being done there. And then we'll do Q&A afterwards, like David said. So this is Dr. John Seeley. He is the lab director, and he has had, gosh, I think over 100 publications and I think 17, if I'm not mistaken, NIH grants, and has worked, his work has really focused on depression, prevention, and also suicide ideology. And so he's now working with the Alliance in Oregon, and Annette Marcus is here with us today. We work with her, and one of our big projects that I'm going to be talking about real quick is, there we go, is the statewide implementation of the Youth Suicide Intervention and Prevention Plan. And the reason, really quickly, that this is important work in Oregon, I know you guys are probably mostly from California, I'm guessing. I'm originally from California. I'm from LA, Dodger fan. And, but I am in Oregon. I've been in Oregon for many years now. And one of the reasons that it's so important that we study this is because Oregon has a much higher rate than the national average. And I think a recent statistic I saw was that it was like 42% higher. And so it's, but as you can see by this graph, and this only goes till 2012, so I'm not really sure exactly where we're at now, but the point here is that for some time, since the 80s, you can see that Oregon on average remains higher than the national average, and that's really of concern. So we have, also like California, we have a youth suicide intervention and prevention plan. And the work that the lab is doing is evaluating the implementation of this plan. So this has been going on since 2008, I believe, and then 2012, and that. Yep, and then our evaluation now is just kicking off. And so using an implementation framework, which I'll get to in a second, if I can get my slide to work. We're looking at the different, and I'm going to skip past a few of these slides because I don't think that they're as relevant right now.
Yeah, I don't think the things were.
Yeah, I don't think so either. Are you helping me out?
Yeah, no.
Oh, thank you. I'm like, okay, every third click works. I was picking up on a pattern. Well, I appreciate your help. Thank you. Can you go one more? Yay. Okay. And then I might have you go back. So So just ignore all the small print here, but the idea is that, so our work in prevention science also looks at things from a much broader level. So when we're looking at how states, how districts implement, we're using this framework, which is an iterative cycle. And essentially what we do is we see how interventions are laid out, and then we work together with stakeholders and evaluate with on different committees essentially how it's looking, how it's working, using data sort of in this iterative fashion to continuously go back to the drawing board, reconfigure if needed, and see how things worked. And that's how we can really get good information on whether things get laid out, even though they're evidence-based practices in the literature. Once they're disseminated and implemented and rolled out, if you will, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be applied in that same way. And that information can really help us out when we're thinking about rolling things out in other places, in other settings, in other states, with other populations, for example. So, okay, since this doesn't work, can you go, yep, perfect. So in the lab, we also have many other research projects going on in addition to this big evaluation that I mentioned. So specifically to social media, we are doing a literature review right now. There's actually not a comprehensive, not one, literature review that really is focused on social media exclusively based interventions for suicide prevention. So there's a smattering of different articles, but nothing that is really comprehensive. So we're working on that right now. And the preliminary results are sort of kind of a peek into what that's looking like at the moment, is that there's a lot of different kind of categories within suicide prevention and intervention work. And they're looking at different things. So there's the contagion that we've talked about already. There's the interventions, which are peer-to-peer. So right now, there's a huge need for this. And I think that this speaks to an issue with research and the tension between research and technology in general, and something I'm really fascinated by. Research is so much slower than technology. And so I was talking with someone earlier this morning, and it's almost laughable when it takes so long for us to publish. And it's like, once we get something published, it's like 2 years behind everything else. And then that's even if you can really get things published quickly. So there's certainly issues within the academic and our knowledge base that we have right now to work with. And so it's really exciting to have opportunities like this where we can have tech people and research people and community stakeholders all in the same room to really kind of share ideas with each other. And hopefully we can catch up with that someday, hopefully in our lifetime. And the other projects that we're doing are more about looking at what's out there for school implementation, rollout guides, the toolkits that are provided, and different communication plans that are available at the state level. So those are things that we think that'll improve upon the work that we're doing in the evaluation process. The next part of this is about the Center on Digital Mental Health. And this is Dr. Nick Allen, and he is the director. He's in the Department of Psychology. And first, I want to sort of orient you to the idea, and I think we can all get behind this idea that our handheld devices, our mobile devices, specifically smartphones, we have an opportunity to record so much and gather so much data on a variety of behaviors, and they sense things that we sometimes can get a better idea of as opposed to self-report. So when you ask somebody to self-report, traditional methods would be, fill out the survey, answer these questions. Well, what's really neat about smartphones, for example, is that they're able to record those things intuitively and sort of effortlessly, if you will, without having to rely on individual self-report. And these things can include things like language, where you are geographically speaking. Facial expressions is sort of the newest wave. We're starting to see that. Social interaction, sleep, physical activity. I don't know how many of y'all have trackers, Fitbits and Apple Watches and things like that. Our phones also do that too, depending on what phone you have. So there's all these different behaviors that our phones can track, and essentially these are all things that are related to mental health in one way, shape, or form. And so in the work that the center is doing, the idea here, if you center around, and this, I'm guessing the pointer doesn't work either, huh? All right, good old fashioned pointing. So if you look at the smartphone, this is the device, and EARS is the acronym that this is given. Essentially, what this is showing is the potential for all of these different behaviors, music choices, geographic location, voice, text, text patterns, words, and also facial recognition is down here, along with activity, can all sort of be aggregated into the phone and then pushed up to a cloud. If you can go to the next one, please. And actually, one more. Perfect. And essentially what that does is that provides us an opportunity for intervention. And that's really where my background has focused on. It's psychology and education, and sort of the combination of those two. And the reason that this is so exciting is, so if you start here, here's an example case user. So here's any one of us, for example, or a student. Here's the phone. The information gets pushed up to the cloud. And then what that does is a series of things happens afterwards. So risk assessment is a traditional method that we use in schools right now. Sort of thinking along those lines of screening and thinking about who needs help when. One opportunity that the phones have is to be able to have geo-linked environmental information, which can then be sort of mapped on to different community-based resources, which are geographically close to or linked and around the person that needs the help. Then there are opportunities for algorithms to be built down here for intervention. So the idea is that there's multiple tiers of intervention. It's not just that everyone gets sort of a phone call or a text, but there's so much opportunity now that we have based on how these algorithms are built to go ahead and then provide different levels of intervention. For example, the first level being sort of these nudges or feedback to users. So that could be something, it's also called like a light touch. So a reminder about, let's say, mindfulness, or some other thing that's a very nice, kind of very easy and gentle approach to intervention. Very different from sitting down in a therapist's office, which are traditional sort of brick and mortar style psychology and psychiatry services typically are. This is different. This is going to be sort of that just-in-time intervention. Similarly, if it's something that needs an additional, depending on, let's say, the text, the sort of the words that this person is texting or using in whatever they're posting, or it could be the facial recognition software can then sort of track the affect of that individual. Then you have the opportunity for more sort of social network-based like sponsors. So this would be something like another student or a family member or another community member that already has permission from that student. And they have said, this person is sort of a safety person for me. So that person might be identified, then they could be sent a text message to say, hey, contact so-and-so, you know, and how are you doing? Check in with them. And then sort of another third level tiered approach would be then our traditional clinical services. This could be something where, you know, other community organizations are alerted to, or the school, the principal, the assistant principal, the mental health professional. So these are just visions. These are things that are hopefully will come to fruition soon, and with support from tech companies and collaboration with tech companies, and certainly there's funding needed. But I think this is a really neat opportunity that we have to move forward with this work. And really, next slide, please. That's all I have for now. Thank you.
Well, you can
Thanks.
stick up here. Stay down. We'll do some Q&A.
Oh, great. Okay.
Yeah, so we'll also have Elias and Jonathan kind of come back and Anybody who has some questions? We have about 10 minutes, right?
I think we might have a little more.
Okay.
And just on logistics, we're really kind of powering through. We're gonna have a late lunch. We have it for 12:30, maybe like 1. So we have a lot more breaks built into the afternoon. So if you need to just come by one, the rest
Nice
of
to meet you.
Feel free to do it. But we still have 2 panels, the relative short panels after this. So just wanted to let you know. And then for questions, if one of you could wear the little mic, and then just
Do you want to wear it?
Everyone in proximity, but you might want to repeat the question.
You want me to do that since I'm okay?
Any of you can do it.
You want to do it? Okay. Yes. Hi, Larry.
Hi, I'm Larry Magid. I mentioned this to Elias earlier, and you also showed kind of a chart over a period of time, and I'm looking at the CDC chart for 1975 to 2015 of teen suicide rates, 15 to 19, and what we're showing is a pretty substantial decline starting at around, looks like around 95, especially for males, and then an increase, kind of an uptake coming back up to 2008. And I'm curious if you have any thoughts, and females seem to be, the line seemed to be a little flatter, with a little bit of a peak around 2004, and then a gradual uptake since then. What's happened? I mean, there's this Dr. Twinge from San Diego who thinks it's all because of social media. There are others that argue that maybe the economy, the crash of 2008, maybe the weather in Oregon's gotten worse. I don't know. I mean, what is happening now with me, or over the last, let's say, 10 years, that seems to be affecting that rate?
I can.
Okay, I'll just stand close.
So it's certainly multifactorial, I think, and several hypotheses have been put forth. So certainly, you know, social media and the new relationship with technology is one factor that has been talked about, but it's much more complicated than that. There's the Great Recession, which you mentioned. There's this big change in prescription rates for antidepressants. I don't know how much the audience is aware about this, but there was an FDA warning that came out about suicidality precipitated by antidepressants, and it's real. It can happen. Fortunately, it's quite rare. But what happened as a result of this is that many children and adolescents who already had depression, potentially suicidal depression, were not being prescribed antidepressants because of this concern. And people think that this is one factor, but they've looked at other factors. You know, the advancing age of, or I should say, the delayed menopause, which has also happened to some degree during that time period, and that can also contribute to mood disorders and potentially the suicidality that is linked to mood disorders. So multifactorial, very, very complicated. We don't understand the why of it, but the pattern is pretty dramatic and pretty clear.
Can I do a follow-up question?
Yeah.
So in Palo Alto, as has been alluded to earlier, we have these clusters, and sadly, I actually know some of the families involved. And in almost every case that I'm aware of, there were mental health issues, diagnosed mental health issues. Yet the media was always looking at, oh, this is about high pressure, Palo Alto, everybody's got to get to Harvard. There was a lot of misperceptions, or at least unclear perceptions as to the causes. Yet I would almost say an underemphasis on the mental health issues that I happen to be personally aware of in several cases.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree that a lot of mental health issues go undiagnosed, and even if they're diagnosed or strongly suspected, they go untreated or undertreated. There's a lot of denial still, even in Palo Alto communities, about mental illness and our child suffering from something like that, and kind of the denial that translates into delayed care or lack of care, which may eventually translate into a tragic outcome. I mean, I think it's part of the answer, but it's, again, a very complicated thing to completely dissect. I don't know if, Jonathan, you want to...
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's multi-layered and multifaceted. I think part of it is just thinking about the 2014-2015 cluster. At least 3 of the cases that I recall, there definitely were, and they were known, the mental illnesses, and at least 2 of the 3 were in treatment. One of them was sort of a shock, and I remember this one because the student was very popular, was on a sports team, went to homecoming, like that one was sort of and there was a similar one in 2009, 2010, one of our good friends, Lily, and her son, similarly very popular, very funny. But if you really take a deep dive and look at their lives and what they were presenting with at the time, I think you can see that there were some mental health related concerns. But I think there's still a misnomer or a misunderstanding around how mental health presents. Like we still think that it presents a certain way. Like if you're depressed, you must look this way. And actually, we know it's a continuum, right? I mean, you might have an agitated depression, or you might have a depression where you're in bed and you can't get out of bed in the morning. But those could both be depression and look really different in 2 different individuals. So I think that's part of it too, is just getting more of an understanding of what these things look like, in real time. Not just what you see on TV or in the movies, maybe.
The only thing I would add to that is that I think a lot about stigma, and then sort of how that looks from a clinical side is that not only is the presenting, there's so much variability within that, but then also there's this whole other layer of the of stigma. And I think that I don't know how much of a role social media and social networks play in that, but I always sort of think about that, especially during adolescence. There's a lot of during that time, developmentally, it's very appropriate to have that, to put on a certain image. And so I think that makes it even more complicated for us to dive deep sometimes, or really figure it out at first glance.
I also think, if I can add to that, I also think the relationship with social media is a pretty complicated one. It's not just about isolation and maybe higher rates of depression. It's also about how the suicidal impulse is negotiated online. Less obstacles maybe than talking to, a real life friend who can, dissuade you or help you access resources. It's easier for the suicidal person online to find people who will agree with them that suicide is the answer, and who will encourage them to pursue suicide. So the relationship with social media and internet-related technologies, I think, is more complicated than simply one of increasing rates of depression or increasing isolation.
I don't know if
Tom, you're next.
Okay. Hi, my name is Annette Marcus. I'm from Oregon with the Alliance to Prevent Suicide up there. So there's this theory around suicide of, I think, a guy named Thomas Joyner promoted, that has 3 aspects that say folks are at higher risk. And it's your perception of being burdensome, of like being a burden to other people. A thwarted sense of belonging, so not feeling like you belong, and increased access to means to kill yourself. And it just really strikes me how social media can contribute to all 3 of those things. And I guess one of the things and I don't expect you to have the answer to this, but one of the things I think about is we know that young people who are rejected by their families, so not just with peers, but if they're rejected by their families, they're at much higher risk. And I'm really struck by kind of the divide there is between families and the life that young people live online. And I guess I'm just kind of wondering if any of you have thoughts about that, or approaches to kind of help navigate that divide.
Yeah, speaking about the online piece, it's probably not my area of expertise. I'll defer to Elias on that one. But I do want to speak to one thing you mentioned, which is, this idea of being disconnected, or this perception that there isn't belonging. And I think about like our LGBTQ population and the importance of that work continuing to happen, because we know that the rates of suicide are much higher in that population. But I also think about, when I think about again, I'm thinking of Palo Alto specifically. When I think of the Bay Area and the diversity, I think about, you know, probably children with parents who may be first generation from other countries that worked really hard to get here and have been really successful. And even then, when their parenting is very loving and kind, and they're not putting that pressure on their child that they have to go to Harvard or Stanford or do it exactly what they did, I have seen in my work at the schools that there's just some kind of like a trickle down that occurs where the children sort of impose on themselves these standards, and then it's reinforced because their peers are in similar boats. So then they're comparing to their peers. And what I've seen as a kind of outcome of all that is a sense of disconnection that this is all reality around me, right? Like there is a perspective that like we are kind of in a bubble here in a way. Like when you look at like the Silicon Valley and you look at the nation and the other countries, but like, well, everybody here is rocking it and they're in like 3 sports and they're the president of this many clubs and they're not sleeping at night, but that's normal. That's normal to them. So there's these comparisons happening. I just think that, again, I know I'm talking in like blanket generalizations, but I do think it can contribute to this feeling that like I'm not really connected, like I don't belong, right? I'm different somehow. I don't know if that makes sense what I'm saying, but
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think again, it's a double-edged sword. I think a lot of people will describe the internet as kids will describe the internet as a wonderful refuge, right? But in my practice, I see plenty of adolescents who have 500, 600 online friends, but feel incredibly isolated and alone. So I think ultimately and fundamentally, it goes back to really consuming these technologies with more self-awareness and in regulated doses. You still want to be grounded in reality. You still want to have real life friends, real life sources of support. In terms of the competition that Jonathan was referring to, I think that's something that I've written a lot about and discussed in my book, like how we present ourselves in social media and the facade that we put out for the world to see, and how that might work on someone who's feeling less than perfect and did not make it into Harvard, but everybody around him or her, you know, has this, you know, wonderful exterior that they're displaying. That's not reinforcing in a good way, and can lead the person potentially to feeling even more inferior and even less competent than they were. So again, ultimately, it's this balance that we should be seeking, and this grounding, and we cannot be, I think, appropriately grounded if 90% of our life happens virtually and on social networks.
And I just want to add that I think that this is also an opportunity for schools and possibly community clinical settings to teach adolescents about this, and really about sort of, I think it kind of goes along with being a good digital citizen. I know most of you have probably heard that term before, but it's sort of that same idea as we're teaching kids how to scan information. That's like, it's an incredibly important skill now in where we are in life in the 21st century, is really, we have so much information coming at us, and what's credible, what's reliable. So teaching, I think that can be embedded, the sort of idea of, you know, what they see, whether it's on a website or it's on a social media platform, for example, that's actually the same skills can apply in both of those ways, both of those settings. So teaching them how to be critical consumers, I think, is what I'm trying to get at. I saw your hand up, but Tom, you still? No, I'm gonna walk towards you.
This is the last question. We will have plenty of time in the afternoon to ask more questions. But of these speakers, particularly Dr. Abu Jade, whose name is Beautiful. Do you think we'll be going?
So I'll be quick. First, thanks to all three of you. I think these are really terrific way to launch the longer discussion. My question is really mostly for Jonathan, which is exciting to see all the things that are being put in place. If we were doing this for influenza or diabetes or almost any other problem, we'd be measuring outcomes in terms of like real medical outcomes, like lives saved, people improving in a whole range of functional measures. Do we have outcomes here on any of the things that have been put in place, even if they're just early stage? It'd be really great to know what's working and who's it working for.
Yeah, it's a great question. And yes, there are outcomes. I think the outcomes, for some of the programs, like the Sources of Strength, there are surveys that they will put out to the entire school, pre-post sort of things where they're getting information on what are the perceptions that students have in terms of, seeking out trusted adults on campus versus actually seeking out trusted adults on campus. What are the ideas and beliefs around help seeking or mental health? And they'll, during the year, Sources of Strength, for instance, will be, running out all these campaigns, right, around mental health or, talking about, like I said, adversity and how people have overcome adversity. And they do this during the year, and then they'll do like a post-test to see if any perceptions have changed. The data, it's there. Like we have the California Healthy Kids data. Programs like Let's Bring Change to Mind started in the schools as a research-based program. So they were still collecting data out of Berkeley, UC Berkeley, when that started. It's self-report data. It's hard to really say, what's causing something. Even with the CDC, when they came out, I mean, they did a very thorough data collection, looking at the coroner's reports and the police departments and the hospitals and the schools, and they aggregated all this data. And I'm still not sure, like if you read the report, anyone can go read the CDC report. You can draw simple conclusions. I think what you can say, and the CDC said this, is that it's moving in the right direction, getting upstream and looking at wellness and mental health and raising awareness. Like all those things are really important. But you bring up a good point. I think it's always a tricky thing, especially for us in mental health when we're in schools. How are we measuring what we're doing? How do we know that what we're doing is working? What variables do we need to tweak, right, to try to control for something and see if that makes a difference? I know my answer is probably not satisfying, but there is a lot of self-report survey data out there from our students and our staff. And I would hope that people smarter than I are analyzing and going to help us, continue to work with the schools to help us figure out how we can improve those efforts. My perspective.
All right. So thank you again for everybody. Thank you for the.
And nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you. I'll grab this from you. We're actually going to move on right now to the team panel. Just grab that.
Got it.
I got a mic for you too.
Was that the mic the whole time?
Yeah, that was.
Okay. Oh no, I don't need that. Yeah. All right. So I think everybody got energized by those Q&As. And again, as a reminder, please start thinking of those solutions, because I think that was the key part, right? We heard about digital citizenship and other aspects that can be incorporated in improving and hopefully reducing teen suicide and then changing some of those trends that we've seen, because I think that's disconcerting. We might disagree about why, or we might disagree about correlation versus causation, but I think we can all agree here that it's a problem, and that's something that we want to see trend down instead of trend up. So without further ado, we're moving on to our teen panel called Teens in the Digital World: Habits, Strategies, and How They Address Their Own Mental Health, right? We don't just want to talk about teens, we actually want to hear directly from teens. Yes. You can clap to that, because I think that potentially is the problem sometimes. It's easy to talk and write about teens, but sometimes we might forget the actual important and integral perspective. So our our moderator, our team moderator is Nadia Ghaffari. She is a senior at Los Altos High School with a passion for youth mental health advocacy. She started the nonprofit Teens Talk after her own experience with aiding in the prevention of a close friend's suicide. Teens Talk focuses on education, open conversation, and youth empowerment to fight the stigma, as we've heard a lot of people say, around mental health. She also spearheaded Teens Talk's first annual Teen Wellness Conference in September 2017. So Nadia, please come on up. You're going to lead the show here for our team panel. Thank you. Thank you. Same here. I'll give you this too, if you don't mind.
No, I think it's like that.
Oh, you got it? Okay.
Yeah,
sure.
Sorry.
I'm trying to see what the best spot might be.
I think it might be like right
Maybe
here.
right there? Sure. That's the bad. I don't want to like it to be too
No,
intrusive there.
it's okay. Where? I'll sit here. Cool. Okay, cool. So I just want to say on behalf of young people, yeah. Do you want to come closer?
Yeah, there's only 4 of us. You can just sit here.
Yeah. Okay, this is better. So yeah, thank you for including us young people in the conversation. I think this is going to be very interesting for everyone. So I'm just going to get right into it. The first question that we want to ask is, actually, let's do introductions. Yeah, good point. So you just heard my introduction. I'm Nadia. I'm a senior at Los Altos High School.
I'm Emma. I'm a sophomore at Gunn High School in Palo.
I'm Tilak. I'm a senior at Alto.
And I'm Danny. I'm a senior at Gunn High School.
Awesome. So just going to jump right into it. The first question that we wanted to ask is, if your access to social media is revoked for a week, what do you feel you lose and what do you gain?
So one of the things that you lose when you lose your access to social media is that there's this whole online world that connects people that you may not be able to talk to as often or be connected to as much, and so there's this flow of ideas and support that you may have from an online community that you might not get as much if you lose it. At the same time, with things like like cyberbullying, social media can be used to harm people as well, and so it's a balance between the two.
I think it's like personally, one thing you gain if you don't use social media for a week is you gain a lot of time, because it does take up a lot of your life. And, not necessarily in a good or a bad way, but it is a time thing. But at the same time, at the end of the week, let's say like you're not allowed to be on social media for a week, at the end of the week, you still have to go back and catch up on all those things. It's like ignoring emails in your inbox. You're saving time for now, but it just piles up. It's almost like emails, yeah, like something you have to check on a daily basis kind of thing.
For me, I think it could be nice because the day would just slow down. You don't have to like focus on anything. You can have like time to just like be bored, I guess. And I guess social media is kind of like, if I don't want to do work, I'll be like, let me just check Facebook, let me just refresh like Twitter or something. But then there's none of that, so it's kind of like I'll be bored and maybe I'll do homework later. I think a negative would be I talk with my friends a lot over it, and so there's some stuff that I'll see and I'll be like, oh, let me share this with this person, let me message them, and that wouldn't be as easy.
Yeah, I'd like to build on something that you kind of all mentioned, is when social media is not a part of our lives, which, that doesn't exist, but in a hypothetical situation, if we didn't have social media, like for me, my eyes are just open to the world around me. Like you observe things that maybe you didn't see before when you were playing on your phone, or spending your time on social media. Like your eyes are opened up to the interactions that you're having in the present moment, and I think that's very valuable. At the same time, you guys also mentioned this. One thing, there's this sort of fear of missing out when we're not on social media. We feel like we're missing out. We want to see what's going on with our friends. We want to see what's going on in the world, and social media provides that for us. So that is something that we gain. We feel connected. We feel informed on what our friends are doing. So as everyone has said today, there are many pros and cons. So yeah, awesome. So the next question that we want to go into is, have you noticed a link between your use of social media and how you feel emotionally? Do you think social media contributes to suicidal feelings, cutting, or other forms of self-harm? If so, how?
I think that on days when I'm using social media a lot, those are also days when I don't feel as good. But I don't know if these two things, if the social media is the thing causing it, or if it's, like a bad day, and so as a result I'm going on to social media, or if the two things are just happening at the same time. So there's obviously, I think to me, there's a connection, but I don't know exactly what it is.
Yeah, I think there are kind of two parts to social media. One where you're posting to the public, and another where you're kind of using it like to message friends and stuff. So in general, I think I use social media more for messaging purposes. So if I was feeling bad, like that is like a resource you have. Like if one of your friends is online, it's someone who you can talk to in a really easy way. Like, even if it's just like, I'm confused on this assignment, or like I don't really feel that well right now. It's like a really easy resource. And I think for posting purposes, I don't post that much in general, but I think I would not post as much if I was feeling bad. And I think part of that is you don't want people, you wouldn't post that to everyone. It's more of a personal thing.
So I don't really use social media as something that I post very often for my personal use, really. I'll use it for like groups that have to do with school or other organizations and events and promoting things like that. But I don't use it to post my own content as much. But it is really nice that you can connect to people and have all these people that you can talk to that wouldn't be there if there wasn't the online world, right? Facebook has a messaging app. So even if you don't have their phone number, you still have a way of contacting them and getting support that you need from people that you might not have been able to without that. And so it is really nice for that.
Yeah, I think social media definitely can have an effect on how we feel. At least with young people in our social medias, I've noticed that we post, as everyone mentioned, we post when we're feeling good, we post good moments, we post good memories, and as a user of social media, going through your feed and just seeing, people smiling, like winning a sports game, an action shot, like posing on the beach, like, wow, these are all such perfect small moments in people's lives. But what we don't realize is that it's such a small sliver of the big picture of that person. Like, as people mentioned, we're not going to post about, like, oh my God, I have 12 hours of homework tonight, let me post about that. Like, no, it's not going to be that exciting for your followers to see. Or if you have a panic attack and you're not feeling so good, that's again not something you're going to post. So what we see on social media is already so filtered and such a small piece of the big picture that I think it makes it hard, like as a user, if you're not feeling so good and you see all these people looking like they're having a blast, it can bring you down, and I've definitely experienced that as well. Does anyone else have anything to add?
Also, I think on how social media relates to self-harm and suicidal thoughts and things, I think I don't think social media is causing self-harm and suicidal thoughts. I think it's just amplifying a lot of the things that are already there, because a lot of social media outlets, I guess, have basically anything out there that you want to see. So when you go through, so when you're on the internet or social media, whatever you want to see, you will see. And so, and it just amplifies your feelings and makes them more intense than they were before. So I do think they can make, that social media can make issues like self-harm and things worse, but I don't think they're the main cause problem.
Kind of adding on to that, social media, like things like Facebook, when you scroll through your news feed and click on, say, a news article, if it has a particular skew, like liberal or conservative, the more you view those things, the more often it'll show you other content that is similar to that. So as you look at like liberal news media and other things like that, more often you'll see more and more of it. And the same goes for conservative. And so if you take that and you start to Dr. Abujad mentioned like how there are websites that do talk about suicide and like ways that you can die by suicide, and quote unquote foolproof ways to do that, right? So the more you see those things, the more often you will, and it escalates, kind of like a downward spiral, and so it's very, very hard to break that cycle, and that can be very detrimental.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Definitely. So moving on to the next question. Do you know someone who has died by suicide? If so, what was the reaction on social media? Did you find it helpful or harmful, comforting or anxiety producing? Explain.
Yes. It's, as Jonathan mentioned, the second suicide cluster in Palo was during my freshman and sophomore years, and then we had another student die by suicide at the very beginning of this year on the second day of school. And so, unfortunately, yes, I do. The response, for the most part, has been many of the same students posting on Facebook and Instagram that if you are suffering with mental illness and grieving, that you're not alone and that they're here to talk, and so that is very uplifting to see. It's not necessarily everyone, but some people will post publicly, some people will privately message their friends, and there have been networks of people that, or students that they set up themselves, and they'll message each other to make sure everyone's safe. And so those kinds of things have been very, very welcome.
I think after my freshman year was when there was a suicide at Palo, I think, and like between Palo and Gun, people were changing their profile pictures to like a "we're all in this together." There are a lot of posts that you can reach out to me, you can reach out to me. I thought it was good, but it seemed to fade pretty quickly just because it's not in the news as much. That's kind of why I wish in schools we have a dedicated time sometimes, like in advisory, where we have like small lessons on this and that. But I wish it'd be like more integrated. Like we can have like 10 minutes in math just like a check-in. Something like even when a teacher just asks you like how you feeling, it's just kind of like you're kind of noticed a little bit more, and it's not just I think we're talking about like prevention and post-prevention. Like we don't have to react to it just after it happens. We can talk about it today, not by tomorrow. It doesn't have to be like a once a week, once a month thing.
I don't really know how well I can speak to this issue because I don't know anyone who's died by suicide, but I was at Gun. It was just at the beginning of this year when someone died by suicide. It was a senior at Gun, and I didn't know him, but I know in the aftermath of that, kind of the feelings that we all had it was really strange to me how some people were angry and some people like kind of felt pity, and some people like I feel like a lot of people who have mental health issues or like could relate to that just felt sad. Really kind of hard to, I don't know. Sad isn't a really good word.
Definitely. Yeah, those were all great responses. We're running short on time, so I'm just going to move on to the next question. So on social media, have you ever made a comment like, class was so boring today, I want to kill myself, or like KMS, or do you know people who make these comments, and how do you think these comments affect those who are truly struggling? How can comments like this send mixed messages and make it more difficult to give support to those who are truly struggling?
So I think one of the very large effects of that is that it kind of invalidates people that actually do feel that way when it's used as a lay term and part of people's vernacular speech. And so there are people talking about depression and being triggered and having thoughts of suicide, but they talk about it as if they're talking about the weather. It's not something that is always taken as seriously as it should be. And so some people, if you remind them, they will take that to heart and make a difference and sort of revise how they talk about issues like that in the future. And so with the CHC, the Teen Wellness Committee, one thing we did last year is we created a social media campaign that was meant to address that. It kind of provided certain words like triggered and depressed and depression and depressed that are often misused, and was meant to educate people about like what the actual word means. Like when you say this is what you really mean, and this is how you can affect people unintentionally by misusing them like this. And so there's, yes, it is used. Yes, people talk about it like that, but social media can also help, even if it is used or misused sometimes.
Yeah, I think we say like we use a lot of like medical psychological terms like in the wrong way. Like I'm addicted to this, or like I'm so OCD about this. I don't think anyone means it in the wrong way. Like no one's trying to stigmatize something. So I just think spreading awareness, and then once people like people say, oh, I'm so retarded, but then they don't realize how like derogatory that is. And then once you tell them like, oh yeah, I get it. So then I think it's just spreading awareness, and then once people start doing it, like everyone will start doing it. I think it's just like the first person.
Well, I think I basically just agree with what you two have said. I don't really have much to add, but it is really normalized. Like people make jokes about like killing themselves like all the time, like at school. Like it's just a normal part of our everyday lives, which is like you don't even really think about it after a while. You just kind of like, oh yeah, that's just how it is. And when you think about it, you're like, wow, that's kind of messed up, like a lot.
Great, so we have 5 minutes left. We can definitely answer these questions at lunch or after this, but the question we wanted to end with is, what do you think social media networks can do to prevent teen suicide?
So
I know it's a big question, but
yeah.
what are your thoughts? what are your thoughts on how social media networks can address this issue?
Well, some of the things that have been done already have been really, really great. Changing the narrative is as Jonathan mentioned before, it's a series of articles published by Gunn's newspaper. They're written by students and staff. So they're all personal stories of how they have struggled, but not focusing necessarily on their struggles, but on how they have overcome them and how they have found strength and hope and healing, and the process of going through that. And so by sharing all these very positive stories, it's been very helpful. It's nice to see that not everything is always awful all the time. And so things like that have been really helpful. The Speak Mindfully campaign that was done by the CDC was really great. I mean, maybe that's somewhat of a biased opinion, but it's I think for the people that it may have helped, it's really great because all it really needs to do is help one person, and that makes it worth it, right?
Yeah. Personally, I like seeing good news in my feed. It's not like I don't think it's a solution. Like, you're not gonna be like, oh, good news, like problem solved. But it's just kind of nice because most news, it's like something bad happened, you're bored, right? So then after, like, I think Hurricane Harvey does a video of like a dog being out of the owner or something. Just small things like that. It's like not gonna solve the problem, but it just kind of like you said, like, not everything's bad. Like, there are good people doing good things.
I don't know if this pertains to social media as much as just the media in general, but I feel like a lot of times people are trying to raise awareness about suicide and depression, and anxiety, and a lot of these different issues. A lot of times people can end up, not quite telling things right in a way that, like, kind of I don't know the word. Dramatizes. Yeah, like things like romanticizing suicide and making it into a love story or a drama is really not the way you want to go. But I feel like the one thing the media could do is, listen to people who have lived in experiences, like, have gone through things, have overcome them, and take into the account the people that are actually being talked about here, because sometimes it can just be people who, really don't know exactly what they're talking about. I mean, almost always it's in good intent, but sometimes it helps to listen to those who have experienced.
Awesome. So I think we're gonna have to end there for time, but we got some really good questions from you guys, and I think we'd love to answer these now or at lunch. But thank you for listening. I think this conversation could definitely go on for hours or even days, but yeah, thank you. Okay, let's go. Thank you. Oh yeah. Let me unclip it. It's
hiding in there too.
It's like can you like reach into my thing and unclip this?
Okay.
Sorry. Did you get it? Okay. Thank you. It's somewhere. Yes. Sorry.
No, that's all right. Thank you so much. Sorry about that. I know this thing's like kind of annoying. There we go. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Good job.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
You're welcome so much. There you are.
Thank you. Okay. All right, should we start off? All right, does everybody want to kind of settle down? I know that was very, very exciting. We're just going to settle down, and we have one more panel before lunch. So if we go long and everybody goes hungry, you can blame me because I will be moderating this panel. So if everybody wants to just grab a seat right now, and then we'll do our intros. Yep. Yeah. So we want to just grab a seat. I think everybody's fired up. All right. Okay. Can I just have everybody's attention, and then we'll just have the last panel, and then we're going to have a lot of discussion again during lunch. So actually, yeah, this is where I need to learn how to whistle. Like every once in a while at a conference, somebody. Yeah, there you go. Thank you. Thank you. All right. So we had the final panel right now before lunch, but before we get into that, I just want to thank Nadia, our student moderator, for leading that great panel. Again, it's great to hear directly from the teen voice. As much as we, as adults, like to pretend we're teens, at the end of the day, I'm still a 38-year-old man. This is not a Tom Hanks movie. I cannot just swap into the teen voice, get struck by lightning or something like that. But what we're going to do right now is we're going to dig in and look at the organizational and industry level about what companies and organizations are doing to reduce and deal with any threats of mental health issues, particularly teen suicide. We're going to have, again, like I said, I'm going to moderate this. We're going to have Scotty Hune from Crisis Text Line, Rachel Madden from YouTube, Christian Crumlish from 7 Cups, Amanda Southworth from Anxiety Helper and Arena, and lastly, Jeff Collins, who we know from After School. So if they all just come to the stage, and we're just going to jump right into this conversation. Yeah, please welcome them. Oh, sorry. All right. Oh, wherever you want to be. Sure, be right there. That might mean you have to start us off. I think that's the joys. I think that's the joys of sitting at the end. And like I said, we're going to be looking at what's going on in the space, dealing with the intersection of technology and mental health. And particularly, and I think this is where it might get interesting and have some debate, some of the challenges that we see from a company level, like YouTube and other companies like After School, and then what we're doing and what we're seeing, any trends that we might be seeing. So our first question, really anybody can start us off. Scotty, you can start us off, or anybody else can jump in, and we can have kind of a free-flowing conversation with this. Our first one is, what have you observed in your work or on your company's platform when it comes to suicide and the mental health of teens? Who wants to start us off with that question? Scotty, you want to, since you?
I can go. Sure.
Oh, go ahead.
Sure. So a little background on Crisis Text Line. We're a 24-hour crisis intervention system. So similar to a suicide hotline that somebody would call into, conduct entirely through text messaging. We're 24/7, anonymous, free to use. And what makes our service really unique is that we have this tremendous source of data, rich data on mental health and crisis in America. And at any time we can sort of get into the pulse of certain issues and where they're occurring, how they're occurring, what other issues are coming up. And to the issue of suicide, we're able to really understand sort of what issues are co-occurring with suicide, what the trends are among demographics, time of year, seasonality. We see that our rates of suicide spike on our platform in the sort of April, May, so like the end of school year and the beginning of the school year in September and August. And our hope is that our learnings from suicide can be then taken to policymakers, taken to schools, to inform outreach, to inform sort of proactive approaches towards suicide. instead of just using the data that we are able to see on our platform.
Okay. And Rachel, what about you from YouTube's perspective? Obviously, that's a very you know, a lot of media attention lately with YouTube and the connection between suicide and as a social media platform.
Yeah, I think people come to YouTube, and what we value and appreciate about YouTube is that people come there to share their story, to talk about their experiences, to give their opinions on different things. No matter what your wonderful or weird interest is, you're probably going to find somebody on YouTube who shares that interest and might be able to offer a supportive voice and so on. But I think one thing that's important about the platform is that we do have rules and policies that govern what is or is not allowed. And while we try to allow as much content as possible on the platform, it is a balancing act, and we're always looking for ways to do more and to better meet the needs of our users. And I think that's why events like this are so great, and why we really appreciate being invited and being able to be here, because we get to hear from young people, we get to hear from educators, get to hear from researchers who can give us so many great suggestions and tips. We often get a lot of good advice at these kinds of events, and it really helps us to learn about how people feel about the product on the ground and how they're using it, and bring that back to our engineering teams and our product teams to help inform us as we roll out new features and new policies.
I'll give you a specific example if you don't mind. I remember a few years ago, there was a trend that received some media attention. It was called the Am I Pretty videos that were popular primarily with teen girls on YouTube. And that was basically the idea where a teen girl will go on YouTube, look at the camera and say, am I pretty? And you could imagine from a question like that, the comments weren't always uplifting, to say the least. So how do you take an issue like that? I mean, is this something where you look at that fine balance of content moderation? Obviously, content moderation is a very delicate issue. Different social mores across the world.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we kind of take a two-pronged approach to it, which is we use both machine learning technology and technology to try to detect and find this content quickly. But then we also use human reviewers, and we need human reviewers because they can look at context and they can understand the different contexts of different videos. So obviously these are tough challenges, and we think people would love us to go back or to try the model of reviewing all content before it goes live, but with 400 hours of video uploaded to YouTube every minute, that is really, really difficult. And so we are dedicated to trying to find solutions to quickly and efficiently review this content. And we've trained reviewers around the world who are online 24/7. So when videos like that are flagged to us or comments are flagged, they're there to review it quickly and make the best decision.
Okay. Yeah, and that's obviously something to kind of think about. And we saw kind of a related topic with Facebook hiring some of their human moderators. So Amanda, from your perspective, what are you kind of seeing from a student perspective with this kind of intersection of mental health, suicide at the larger kind of end in technology? We just saw from the team panel about, does this increase or our levels of anxiety, or is that something that's not kind of causally related?
Yeah. So, well, for those of you that don't know, I'm 16 and I'm also an iOS developer. So I've run a mental health app for about 3 years. So I do a lot of work with teenagers, and I do a lot of work with people in the field, a lot of one-on-one and also online communications. And something that I've noticed about teens and stress and social media is that teens are in a very stressful time right now. I mean, they're planning for their careers. They're figuring out their sexuality. They're doing all of this other stuff, and they have extra societal pressures. And social media can really exacerbate that. I mean, when you don't know who you are, and then you go on social media and you see all of these people just having fun and being happy with themselves and being complacent in their lives and content, it's really hard for teens to not feel like, I want that and I need that, and that's what I need to be happy.
Yeah, that's kind of the idea what we talked about with like Instagram envy. And as we heard some of the speakers talk about before, how we kind of surround ourselves potentially with friends, but not having somebody if we had something serious like a car accident or cancer. So Jeff, what about yourself? What are you seeing with after school?
So again, you're going to hear some of the backstory about after school at lunch, so I won't go too much into that, but I'll mention that something somewhat unique about after school is that It's a social network for high school students where they can communicate with other students at their particular high school, and they can also communicate anonymously. As Rachel touched on, we similarly have both the technical and human moderation. But what we see that I think is important and touches on Amanda's comment is that because you can be anonymous, we see that teens will talk about things they're unlikely to talk about in other places where people have these carefully curated identities. And so that means talking about issues like depression or difficult issues like pregnancy or coming out. And what I would say we really see three things from that. One is it allows users to see that other people are experiencing similarly tough issues. So in that way, it can serve as kind of an antidote to some of the other networks. Two, we usually almost always see positive responses, people trying to buck up their peers. And then three, and this goes to kind of a later part of our discussion, tying into Scotty, what we do through our moderation is we detect people who might be having a mental health issue, and we give them the opportunity to connect to crisis text line. And we've referred tens of thousands of young people and to professionally trained counselors. And so this is kind of a real area of promise, I think.
Yeah, and as some of the earlier speakers talked about, right, how we present ourselves online might be a little different than how we might privately communicate online, and something that's maybe less public. We're thinking about our digital footprint, not necessarily our mental health. So, Christian, from your perspective, tell me a little bit more about 7 Cups and some of the stuff you're seeing.
Yeah, and I think I can connect to a couple other things people were saying as well. So, for people who don't know, 7 Cups is a service. The primary offering is anonymous peer support, one-on-one chats, group chats, and online community. We also offer professional therapy, a paid tier. We refer people in crisis and expressing, active suicidality to more qualified services for that sort of thing. So it's also part of a triage model of task shifting in the healthcare world to get sort of the people who need clinical intervention, that sort of help, and the people who need help with their wellness or maintenance of their well-being, or even maintenance of chronic mental illness, but day-to-day maintenance. That's more of the tier of support that we're offering for people. Among the teens on our service, probably the unique issue that they have different from the adults. Everybody says, I have stress, I have anxiety, I have depression. I mean, those are the top things across the board. But bullying is on the teen list, where maybe something like work stress or relationship stress might exist for adults somewhere in a similar tier. I think the anonymity that we have is probably a key part of the social design of the whole environment. I think it connects to what you're saying about after school, at least the anonymous option there, because in some ways it flips the script on that FOMO, fear of missing out phenomenon that the teens were talking about. And I think it's pretty well attested to. You hear, we've all been on Facebook, we probably all know what this feels like, which is you see everybody else's shiny exterior, you have access to your not always perfectly shiny interior, it has dark places in it or whatever, and you compare yourself and you go, well, they're surfing and they're at a wedding and they're in Hawaii and I'm sad and have homework, or whatever is the moment, and you have that feeling over and over again. And occasionally you perform your own happy moments for other people, but that just sort of contributes to the same dynamic, because you're not that way all the time. But you're building up a personal identity around your actual name, so you don't want to advertise, I had a panic attack, as one of the things mentioned, or I'm feeling vulnerable, or please bully me and make fun of me now that you know what my weaknesses are, and things like that. Anonymity and some of the other sort of the moderation and the structural things in the way that 7 Cups work really are designed to reverse that entire dynamic entirely, so that people, knowing that what they say is not going to be added to their permanent record in some sense, can talk about their most difficult, personal, most vulnerable feelings and get support from other people. And then the phenomenon for everybody else is to see that they're not alone, that other people have the same interior they have, that they also suffer, that they're also lonely. Teens are not the only lonely people in America or on planet Earth. Everybody's lonely. It's a super lonely place these days, and it doesn't matter how many friends you have on Twitter or people all around you in the moment. People feel lonely and disconnected. So anyway, I don't want to go off on a tangent. Sure. But one other thing about suicide, I just want to say anecdotally, I know so Laura Gregorio was supposed to be here. She had a minor kind of sports accident, but had to get in to see the doctor today. And she runs our clinical, she's a trained psychologist and could speak more to that type of things. I'm the head of product, so I can can talk more about how things work and why. And I'm also concerned with growth and traffic and all those sorts of things. And I look at our data, and one day I saw we were having a big spike on the app. I was like, what's going on? And typically you can go into Google Analytics and see that you're getting someone you got written up in the Atlantic, or there's an article on you somewhere, and you're getting a bunch of new traffic that day. But it wasn't really, it seemed buried in there. It seemed like maybe it was coming from Twitter, because we get some traffic from Twitter all the time, but that seemed to be higher than usual. So then I looked to see if some super famous person on Twitter had mentioned us, and that was not true. But then digging a little bit deeper, what I found out was that K-pop star Jonghyun Kim had committed suicide and had written an incredibly poignant letter from the point of view of somebody who had been suffering with suicidal thoughts and had sought help from a doctor who told him that it kind of was his fault and he couldn't be cured or something like that, and made all kinds of preparations for his friends and celebrated all their birthdays before he killed himself and did this ritual that a lot of other teens, it turns out, could relate to in a scary way. And a lot of them, their reaction is to say, if you feel that, I look to you when I feel sad. You look so beautiful when you dance. I'm a pop star fan, but I kind of a little bit of that. It's in my future stuff. But the gist of it was that if you can't handle, if you checked out, what does that mean? And a lot of them expressed a desire, like, I want to follow you or something like that.
Yeah.
And the thing is, so suddenly we have a whole bunch of Korean-speaking users on our app because people on Twitter recommended it. And they had used it before, and it just became a word-of-mouth phenomenon. People who are known in that world were recommending it, and there was an article in Malaysia, and it kind of picked up again. But all we needed to do really was throw up a couple alerts and threads saying, this news alert, this pop star died. If you're having trouble, here's the place to gather. And the Korean speakers found each other and offered each other support and said, I just joined to get support. I just joined to give support. And while we're not equipped to help people who are feeling suicidal in the moment, the whole surrounding thing of approaching that or feeling in despair or worrying about this or having it even in your mind, that we can help with, and anyway, that comes back to it.
Okay. Yeah, and then you mentioned, Christian, the product kind of design, and that's the hot topic right now with social media platforms. As I mentioned kind of earlier, we had that recent announcement that's potentially pretty monumental of Mark Zuckerberg talking about 2018 being the year that we should try to have meaningful type of interaction online. Obviously, certain people might be skeptical of that statement, maybe think it's more PR, but I guess we'll find out. I think the tension, somebody like Google and YouTube could attach. This is the question, right? How do we strike that balance between engagement, user engagement, and the mental health of users, as we talk about with how social media might impact users? And what I'm getting at is a lot of the Facebook pushback was dealing with maybe internal research, which was showing prolonged use and how it might adversely impact some of its users. The criticism from certain people about Zuckerberg's decision would deal with, well, is that going to be then bad for the company, for Facebook? Are you going to be decreasing the engagement? Because what if internally it's showing that, quickly said, miserable people might spend more time on a platform when social media typically is based on a freemium type of model where the pressure is on increased user engagement? How do you kind of strike that balance? So specifically, and Jeff, maybe we'll start with you. How do companies see their kind of role right now with promoting teen mental health and wellness? Because maybe before it went from like a hands-off libertarian type of approach, but now it seems like there's a lot more public pressure on social media companies to do something.
So I think that many of the social media companies have for quite a while focused on online bullying and cyberbullying. So there's been a lot of work on online safety. As Rachel and I both mentioned, technical moderation and human moderation. And as a teen network, we kind of err on the side of taking more things down. One of the challenges I'll just briefly mention and then get to the question more directly is teen language is difficult to decipher because it's nuanced, it's acronyms, it's GIFs, and so we are always trying to stay in touch. We have high school interns. We're always trying to adapt and improve our technical and human moderation, but that's a challenge. But more directly to your question, what we've done, and I think other companies are doing this too, is we're focusing more on digital citizenship, which is looking at this issue more holistically, and instead of just kind of block bullying, you have these online bullying campaigns. And of course, many of you, everyone here probably knows, you know, most kids aren't even using the term bully. So we're trying to put things in our app that encourage high school students to get involved in social change campaigns, environmental awareness campaigns, register to vote. And we do this with partners like DoSomething.org, Countable.us. The challenge here is we are not a civic engagement app. We are, you know, an app to help to allow kids to share and talk to one another. So we try to integrate these things in a way that is somewhat subtle and is not as in your face, because we all know from our own experience that like a CDC campaign, like This Is Your Mind on Drugs, you know, is not that effective. So our creative team spends a lot of time thinking about how we can influence people positively to be good digital citizens. That's something that's evolving, but I think that's kind of the trend I see.
Okay. And Rachel, what about yourself from YouTube's perspective? We recently saw Google launching the Be Internet Awesome campaign with the connection of ConnectSafely and the Family Online Safety Institute. So what are you kind of seeing from Google or YouTube specifically standpoint about the responsibility towards mental health?
I think there's a couple of things that we do to try and help with mental health teams, and I look at it kind of with two prongs. So I look at the things that we do in the platform, our features, our operations, and then I look at the campaigns and the projects that we can help support. So within the platform, within YouTube itself, we have things like we'll show one box for certain suicide-related queries that has an SSL phone number and the crisis text line text option. For users that flag content for suicide or self-harm, we send them a message as well to thank them for flagging this difficult content to us, and to also provide them with resources, because, you know, I don't personally, in my personal use of YouTube, stumble across a lot of this content. So we figure that if you're finding it and flagging it, maybe you're looking for it and maybe you also need some support. And then I also mentioned our policies. We work with, you know, experts to try and make sure that these policies are in the best place and taking into account, you know, someone's potentially in a very vulnerable state, and how do we take that into account when we're enforcing our policies. And then when it comes to projects and campaigns, you know, there's a couple of things that I was thinking about as I was thinking about this panel. You know, there was a couple of years ago the It Gets Better campaign. I don't know if anybody remembers that. But that video is from Dan Savage, who was quite shocked and sad about the number of LGBTQ teens who were committing suicide. And he uploaded this video with a powerful message of, you know, it gets better. And that has over 2 million views on YouTube. There were over 50,000 other videos uploaded. And a lot of people mentioned, you know, there could be celebrities uploading it or people on the public eye, but a lot of regular users and people who aren't in the public domain mentioned that people reached out to them and confided in them. And I think that's a pretty cool way that technology is being used to save lives and to help people who feel isolated. And then we also have, it's slightly off topic, but Creators for Change. This is a program that we launched in 2016, and we're basically trying to work with creators to help them as they use their voice and their YouTube channels to tackle really difficult social issues. So they try to promote tolerance and understanding and empathy, usually around hate speech or xenophobia or terrorism, but it's a really cool example of how I think creators are using their voice to maybe show the world or show their fans a different perspective about something, or a different opinion about something, or open up their mind to something new.
Yeah, and as we kind of touch upon this idea of moderation as well, I think sometimes from an outside perspective, it seems simple. Hey, why don't we have less hate online? Why don't we have more positivity online? Be kind, you know, put a bumper sticker on your car and it's all good. As we know from the actual logistic standpoint, it's not always as simple. One interesting kind of phenomena that I mentioned kind of earlier that I'd like to discuss is this concept of digital self-harm or self-cyberbullying, just to really showcase how thorny some of these topics is or are. So a recent study by the Cyberbullying Research Center that collected a national sample of 5,700 middle and high school students, they found that up to 6%, interestingly enough, more men than female engage in this concept of digital self-harm, and that would be sending yourself messages saying kill yourself. And this happened in a few kind of infamous situations. I think that shows you maybe again how difficult this can be to spot. So Scotty, I'd love to kind of hear from you if you wouldn't mind. How do we deal with a topic that is so nebulous, that is so difficult sometimes to understand, right? We can say that social media is impacting our behavior dramatically, but we don't necessarily know how it's impacting it.
I'd say step one, which is probably speaking to why the 5 of us on our panel are here now, is that there needs to be a tight feedback loop between all 5 of our companies, which is to say that we all interact with users at a different stage in their own mental health life cycle. And we do the best when we're all talking to each other, learning from each other, and feeding each other's insights into each other's platforms. So in hearing about YouTube, thinking about how users from YouTube, for example, will end up at crisis text line. And we'll be working with those users to get them from a crisis moment to a cooler calm. But we'll be learning stuff in those conversations that can then be fed back into YouTube's platform. So for example, YouTube could then think about how they could proactively reach out to users and look for different terms relative to interventions. So really knowing that we all see users at different times, but using that large knowledge base together, we can actually reach more of the users who are in crisis quicker and make, I think, all of our platforms stronger together.
Mm-hmm.
Speaking specifically to self-harm, what we see on our platform is about 15% of our conversations talk about self-harm. And among our youngest users, so we see 75% of our users are under the age of 25, but particularly with that 13 and under group, we see that self-harm over-indexes. So about 20% of our users who are 13 and under are having conversations about self-harm. And really working to understand where are those conversations coming from, what other topics, trends, hour of day, timing, all the different characteristics of these conversations, and trying to feed it back into the public domain. So that as a mental health community, we can all learn from those trends and try to be more proactive about outreach.
So why do you think something like self-harm exists? And maybe Amanda, you like to chime in on this, right? I know it initially got popularized by social media researcher Dana Boyd in 2010, and she kind of speculated that maybe it was a cry for help, it was a way to kind of position yourself, and that maybe there's some kind of relationship between that behavior. Yeah, so Amanda, and then we'll go to Christian.
So I think that digital self-harm can be a form of expressing your feelings. Like you said, it's especially higher within men.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of the studies that I found show that men tend to bottle up their emotions more and not reach out for help more. So I think that digital self-harm is a form of them trying to get out emotions that they feel. And they have to do it in a safe place, and they have to do it in a way that's not really scaring anybody. Because if you text your best friend, hey, I want you to die, your best friend's gonna be like, dude, what the hell? But if you text yourself, I want you to die, it's safe with you, and you don't have to worry another person about that. So maybe it's a form of coping in therapy, a really messed up form of coping in therapy, but still a way where you can get those feelings out so that you don't have to bottle them up anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the same with physical self-harm, with like cutting yourself or burning yourself or walking into roads without looking. It's just a form of getting your emotions out there and dealing with them, not in a productive way, but in a way that makes you feel better.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Christian, you said
Yeah,
you
I would
wanted
just
to
say,
tack onto that.
well, some of the people on our system can talk to teens. We do background checks on adults, and and so I talk to teens on our network. I mean, some of the people I've spoken to have struggled with cutting and other forms of self-harm. And if digital self-harm is really the equivalent of that, and I think it's an open question if it is, that's the right name for that, but let's see. I think what seems to me is that what's described as something like a compulsion or an addiction that gives relief. So it's more like like the addict to an opiate, like whatever the problems there are in their life, it boils down to do they have a fix or not? It simplifies life, or it kind of like shuts off the noise. You know, it's a focus. And I think self-harm for some teens it shuts off the sort of emotional noise and somehow focuses in a way that gives a lot of relief. And so what I think is potentially valuable there, and again, I don't know if digital self-harm partakes of these same things, is that it's a poor coping mechanism, but it's a coping mechanism.
Sure.
So that person is already on the track to trying to cope. You know, if that can be turned, if they can learn more healthy ways to cope, if they can break a habit or replace it with a new habit, there's something to work with there.
Okay. And then I think our final question, to respect everybody's time before lunch, what are some of the biggest challenges that you're seeing from your company or organization perspective? So Rachel, we can start with you with YouTube. So what type of challenges are you seeing from YouTube's perspective?
I think we know that we can always do more, and we want to do more. And you know, the questions we ask ourselves are we sending people the right resources? How can we bring people together? And so things that always crop up when we're talking about this is how do we reach the people that need us at the right time with the right messages? Being very respectful of people's privacy and, as I said, the vulnerable state that they're in. So it's kind of this balancing that I kind of mentioned about earlier, and that's something that I think we think about a lot when we're looking at our policies, we're talking with folks in the industry, and when we're rolling out new features.
Okay, Amanda, what about from your perspective and being maybe as an advocate for a lot of this work?
Well, from my perspective, a lot of kids are reluctant to seek help just because there's such a stigma around it, especially with teenagers right now. They're like, parents usually kind of turn them away, and they're like, you're just being emotional right now, you're being defiant, you're being this or that. And it kind of prevents them from seeking out help. And that's really a thing that my app struggles with, is how do we get users to kind of let down their ego and let down their kind of prohibitions about what mental illness is, and how do we get them to talk about it and to learn about it and to deal with it in a productive way that they don't think is stupid or hurtful. And a lot of the problems that I personally have as an indie developer, and that other companies that work with mental health might have, is that there's not a lot of reach. Well, there is a lot of reach, but there's not usually a lot of budgeting to go around with funding and stuff. And it's definitely a struggle with marketing. It's like, get out there and find the people who need you without going person by person and looking through all of this other data that can be irrelevant. You can take 10 to 15 hours of your time just looking for someone who can help.
We're in San Francisco, so we can say, how do we scale that?
Yeah,
that's fine. So, Jeff, from your perspective, from after school.
By the way, when Amanda and I were texting this morning about both being in traffic, she said, "Oh, San Francisco is just LA, LA for geeks." So I think I touched on kind of two of the main challenges. One is figuring out the right way to engage with young people on these important issues in a way that resonates with them. It's cool, and they're not going to think you're lame and go to another network. And then, so that's something we're always trying to work on with our design. And the second is detecting troublesome or potentially troublesome behaviors or things that they talk about. And this goes to what Scotty said. I think we're getting much better at these integrations and learning, for example, like data from crisis text line, the users we send them, we're able to improve how we do that. Digital self-harm is one of these challenges because it is new, somewhat new to society in general, and it's complex and nuanced. So we will block messages, offer users the opportunity to connect with crisis text line. But we've seen that sometimes families will be unfamiliar with this issue. So I think spreading awareness of it is important. And then I'll just end with, I think what we need to do on digital self-harm, along with some of these other issues, goes back to what Elias said, and that's essentially a call for more research. So the Cyberbullying Research Center did this survey, and it's within like the last 6 months they published this, but there's not much out there on it, and they're digging more deeply into it. So I think, you know, we are here for that reason, to put our minds together.
And I think that organization actually said they did that research because they couldn't find any other research. So maybe it shows you the lack and potentially the need for it. So Christian, what about from 7 Cups? What are some of the challenges that you're seeing there?
Well, I'd say for us, it's measuring outcomes. having a good sense of who we're helping and who helps, what interventions help, which which sorts of people with which kinds of problems. A lot of it comes down to the data, studying it better, correlating it with other data out there and with other exchanges, consortia efforts and things like that. But I'd say broadly as a product person, it's about getting beyond kind of Silicon Valley addiction type metrics, like retention or growth for its own sake. I need to distinguish good from bad outcomes. So I care if people stay or they go. I need enough people to stay to keep the lights on, but I don't want people who stay for the wrong reason because they're like addicted and it's not helping them. And I need to be okay with people who leave for the right reason because they got the help they needed and they're not chronic. And I need to count that as a win and look at, because what you measure is what you optimize.
Sure. Yeah, that kind of gets into the ethical design, attention economy.
So it's not an externality, like we're just not throwing off waste like that, but actually including it in our model.
Sure, sure. And then Scotty, we'll end with you and then we'll go off to lunch. So
I think two main challenges, both that Amanda and Jeff have touched on here. First one's definitely scale. As a company, we did 1 million conversations in our first 3.5 years. We're going to do nearly 2 million in the next year. So it's tremendous growth, and what that really speaks to is penetration of mental health services across the country. It's exciting that we're destigmatizing the space. What that means is that there needs to be a much larger investment of resources in the servicing of these new communities who now have an awareness of the mental health space. Second challenge, I think, is breaking down barriers. We're all developed in these siloed spaces of social media companies, of crisis intervention, mental health research. If we're all going to work together and create a tight feedback loop, that means breaking down barriers of maybe when we might have a more adversarial relationship. Instead, it's working together. And I'll leave just on one more optimistic, uplifting note. On our platform, we find that 67% of texters share something with a counselor they've never shared with anyone else before. I think there's a tremendous opportunity here in all the work that we're doing, and it's exciting that the space is moving in this direction. I think we should be tremendously optimistic that we're going to be able to fight these challenges, overcome them together, especially working as a united group.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, I'd like to thank each and every one of you for coming here and offering your insight. And again, for additional information on everybody's bio, please look in the program. So again, give everybody a warm round of applause here and go to lunch. Thank you.
We're about 10 minutes behind. Congratulations on making it a very densely scheduled morning. So we're going to head upstairs. It's kind of a buffet. Get yourself find a seat. We have additional chairs. Some people might want to stand. We'll have a couple speakers. We kind of purposely built in some padded time, so we're more likely to end sometime closer to 5 p.m. So just factor that in if you're commuting or something. But otherwise, it's going to be much more fun, interactive. So please head up and get lunch started.
All right. Great job. Well, yeah, we should chat sometime about everything that YouTube is doing. So. Yeah. Oh my gosh, that really is going on.
It is.
Yeah.
Having a coughing fit.
Right.
Okay. So now we can broadcast to the slides, which are nowhere to be found. Dang it. Okay.
Particularly since you mentioned that, like, marketing, finding the people who need help is part of the work. But we have a lot of people who need help, and the endless need for that. So it's not like we want to be like stingy about only use our help, don't use their help.
Let's see if I now go here.
I'm gonna sit with you guys. How are you guys? Are you guys going on? Oh,
yeah. Yeah, we're still broadcasting.
Why should I? Really good. I should have said it. No, you did really good.
No, it's my
everything got it.
Dude, I'm like 10 to my board games going down.
I was looking at everything. Oh,
I think it's because of what years of like there hasn't been any more scares me like stories.
Oh, this is
You guys start broadcasting everything.
loud enough that everyone can hear.
No, this is the live stream.
Oh, okay. Oh, that's good.
Does Jeff want to give us a signal, or are you ready?
I think we're good. Yeah, I think we're good.
Ready to go? All right, I'm going to yell here. We're going to get started. Got a little bit of lunch and learn, if you will. So I'm pleased right now to have right next to me, we have Michael Callahan, the co-founder and CEO of After School. Michael is passionate about making a measurable positive impact on the world by enabling communications through technology. So please welcome Michael, or hear him as you're kind of munching away.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. Thank you to all you guys, everyone that helped put this together. Obviously, a lot of work. You guys are getting a vibe of what it is that we're trying to create here. The first thing that I wanted to give an update on is general purpose progress. So everybody here is, kind of has a different background, also a different occupation as well. But I just wanted to kind of give an anecdotal update of some progress. So when I started high school, my dad told me stories about what happened to him when he was in high school. And he was bullied by a guy. This was the time when people went by two-word monikers. Hard Guy Harvey was the guy that bullied him. And when he talked about being bullied, what he meant was actual physical harm. So this is, people that beat the crap out of you and, things like that. Now, obviously, that type of stuff still exists today. But when I looked back at my dad and I told him, like, people don't bully people anymore. And what I meant was like that. My own personal experience, when I was in high school, I was always a very creative person, and without functional abilities to create things, then I put that into how I dressed and how I looked. And societally, it's known by everyone in this room that what we do is we stigmatize people that are different for any way, shape, or form. And so that's something that happened to me, albeit I was self-imposed different, where some people don't have that option. They're just naturally born different. And so for me, I remember, in junior high, I was in a class with some older kids, and a kid that was like a big guy. He looked across the room. He was a year older than me, and he just mouthed to me. He looked at me, we locked eyes, and he just mouthed to me, "I'm going to kill you." And he repeated that, and I was like, "What the hell?" I played baseball with this kid, like maybe 5 years ago, but what does he have against me? Like, what the hell? And so I had other instances that were like this. So that when we compare it to what my dad experienced, this was just kind of verbal. I also had, people that, because of how I look, they just hate me instantly, which was, I got used to it. Ultimately, I got used to it, which a lot of people that are here probably, if they went through similar things, they got used to too. But it became a common thing, and I started keeping track of the number of people that just walked up to me and then spit in my face. And, that's not something that you want to deal with. But the bigger thing, going back to that concept of progress, is these people didn't kick the crap out of me. That's great. That's the result of a lot of people like you guys working in the school systems and otherwise to take that stuff down a notch. My dad was in school, maybe 20 years before I was, and then since that time, it's been about 15, 20 years since then. And we moved in that, further direction from, overt harm, physical harm, to maybe verbal, kind of less physical harm, and then now we're into kind of an era of more digital harm. And although that still sucks, I think we still have to acknowledge that progress has been made across that spectrum. And obviously each one of those has their own nuances that can be worse than the last. But I assure you that because of the work of you guys, that will continue to move in that direction. The problems ultimately won't go away, but they'll change form, and hopefully for the better. So I want to give an update on that. Now, another kind of personal story for me. So when I was in high school, particularly for this conference regarding suicide. So when I was a junior in high school, I went away to a summer camp, and it was at a college. And at the time, I had been dating a girl, and we had been dating for about 3 or 4 years at that point. We started dating really in junior high, and we dated all the way through high school. And this was the first time that the two of us were apart by that amount of distance and for that amount of time. Cell phones really didn't exist too much. And so this summer camp was at the University of Illinois. So they had some underage kids in college dorms, and her and I had spent a lot of time on the phone each night. We'd sit there and talk on the phone, all night, much like people would text today. So we did the same thing there. I picked up the corded phone and stretched it onto the really crappy dorm bed, and then just sat there and talked to her. But we kept our door open because that was kind of customary in a college setting. And she could hear people talking in the background, and she could hear females talking in the background. And I wasn't doing anything. She was just hearing, overhearing girls talk in the background. And so her mind really raced, especially with not having, me to take up some of her time. Her mind raced of, what could be going on. And ultimately, I draw your attention to this fact that in this situation where she wanted to have control, she didn't. And so during one of those conversations on the phone, it was obvious to me that she was upset and she was sad, but she took it even further, where one of the times what she did was she said, "I'm going to go kill myself," and then hung up the phone on me. And I went, my mind raced with, what the hell am I supposed to do? So I'm 17 at the time. What am I supposed to do in this situation? So the obvious answer that most people would say will be, why wouldn't you call the police? Why wouldn't you, these are the obvious answers. But you're not thinking like a teenager if you think that that's the answer. And I'll tell you what I thought. I understood that that was an option, but I also understood that in the event that she didn't do anything to herself, that the stigma that would come from her parents treating her differently or getting the police involved or so on could actually impact her in a negative way that could ultimately end up the same way as if she had done it anyways. So I really didn't know what to do, and I tried the best that I could. And I got on the phone and tried to, the best thing I could come up with was try to call somebody that was a good friend of hers that was lived physically near where she did. And so I called a friend of mine who called that friend, who then sent someone over. And there's a period of time where I have no idea what's going on. And during that period of time, that you could say, especially for someone who's 17, this is the worst moment of your life. This person that you care a lot about has just told you that they're going to go kill themselves. So a couple hours later, I got a phone call, and it was from her, and she was alive. And this was now the best moment of your life. And so this emotional roller coaster of worst experience of your life to best experience of your life is really challenging as a kid to go through. And during the time of that summer camp, that was, let's say, on day 4, and it was a 2-week summer camp. And over the period of time of the remainder of the summer camp, she did that 3 more times. And that was just horrifying for me. It's just so exhausting, absolutely so exhausting, because obviously you want to take the person seriously, regardless of how many times they've said that they're going to do this such a thing. So anyways, I share that story just because of, the visceralness that I knew of that experience and the complexities that a kid would go through in thinking about how the hell do they handle these situations. So, kind of not to be on the downer side of things, everybody here is, fully aware that it's tough to be a kid, and you may have either experienced that firsthand as you guys were growing up, or you work with people today who it's very obvious that that's what's going on. So the story that I gave about my girlfriend at the time, who's still alive, she's married, I think she has a kid, everything worked out. That stuff still goes on today, and whether it's done on a corded phone, a cordless phone, text messaging, a social media app, it doesn't matter. It's always going to be there. But as time progresses and things move into a more digital space, it gives us more opportunities. So you just think of, like, who is supposed to intervene in that situation? Who's supposed to help the kid who is dealing with this, or her who is dealing with this? Well, there was no one in between other than, the AT&T, who they don't have the capacity to monitor these things and so on. So as technology continues to get better, it gives us more opportunities. And I think that's one of the biggest things. And one of the things that I wanted to just kind of communicate as with respect to suicide as a general kind of takeaway, it's a full spectrum, it's a multi-step kind of process, but when someone shows some sort of sign of being suicidal. You know, the two main things that we can do, we as people that are trying to help, basically, in my personal opinion, they're doing these things as my girlfriend was, either for attention and or they want something to change. And that's kind of what I wanted my takeaway message to be here, is that when you experience kids that do have show some kind of suicidal tendencies or something, just acknowledge that, one, they need more attention. And two, they want something to change in their life. And this is their best way that they can figure out of how to do that. So keep that in mind. Obviously, a lot of you guys are way more trained than I am in dealing with these things. And that's part of the reason why we're having this conference. So that the knowledge that you guys know can impart us, the service providers, so that we can really make a difference. Thank you.
Mike, can I grab that mic from you? Go. Okay, we have one more lunch speaker. Our next speaker is Christopher Munch from the Suicide Prevention app. Chris, I'll read your bio right here. So Chris has an eclectic background in the field of mental health, developing and managing programs for physically and developmentally disabled youth, teaching through UCLA's extension program, working with at-risk youth in numerous capacities, and has even worked on a mobile suicide response team dedicated to servicing children. His passions, aspirations, and dedication include influencing, supporting, developing, and designing things to advance social, physical, and mental wellness through innovation. And we'd also like to add, Jeff was kind of adding this as well, that you've been very helpful in helping us organize this event since the beginning. So please welcome Chris.
I just want to say thanks for everybody for having me out after school. I know that was awesome. My heart is still a little bit racing, and I'll share this in our the roller coaster ride.
I got to experience that roller coaster ride, unfortunately for the wrong reasons. But as David mentioned, I run a nonprofit innovation firm based in Southern California, and we created the Suicide Prevention app. It is the world's first publicly distributed standardized screening measure with data reporting features. I'll share with you a little bit more about that project, but I would really like to express why we decided to build this product. So I lost my first best friend to suicide. His name was William. We were 10 years old in the 4th grade, and that was 25 plus years ago. At that time, the stigma ran deeper than bone, and there was no protocol in place, as Jonathan had mentioned, what's going on now in the current school systems. And unfortunately, I didn't find out for years later that it was a suicide, because the school's only protocol was to tell us that William moved away. The interesting side is that he lived right across the street from the middle school, and so as we all transitioned to middle school, we watched William's parents come and go, and we're wondering, where did William go? And the house eventually started dilapidating and got boarded up, and it's almost a lost cause. I have no idea what happened to William's family, and knowing what I know now is that his parents are now at a higher risk of suicidality on their own as a result of losing a child to suicide. So from 10 years old, 4th grade, over the course of the next 10 years of my life, I lost 3 additional friends to suicide that were all within my immediate social network. They weren't my best friends, but they were right there. And then in 2010, I lost my second best friend, and this was my road dog. This was the person, you know, I'm not gay, but I love that man more than anything. And he was a combat veteran, and I was the last person to see him alive. And every warning sign that you can imagine was there. And because of my high-risk lifestyle and his high-risk lifestyle, I thought it was common. I thought it was okay, and I thought it was normal. So I had no idea that when we wanted to go drinking and go run and climb a building and jump off stuff and go drive on the freeway, that all these things were actually not good for our own well-being. So his death sparked an interest in me to seek a better understanding of the mental health system. I then went into psychopharmacology, looking at the neurological developments of the human brain after exposure to bomb blasts. And then I got trained as a mental health professional. I went on to get my master's degree in social work, and I went through the full clinical process to get trained. And at that time, I was offered a PhD program in the Middle East, working with the Israeli Trauma Coalition to understand the effects of PTSD after bombs explode. I turned that down at the last minute to work on one of 6 mobile response teams in the United States. It was a children's response team based in Ventura County. I think Boston, New York, and a couple other places have it. That team has since dissolved. So now to date, we only have 5 response teams in the US that are dedicated to servicing just children. And essentially what it was is I was bestowed with the power to make the clinical determination for an individual under the age of 17 on whether or not they required involuntary psychiatric hospitalization. My brain runs really fast. I process things really quickly. I kind of see between the lines, I don't know, abnormally. And within 30 days of working on that team, I started to notice the flaws in what I believed were the system. And so my opinion's not pessimistic. I'm a very opportunistic and realist, but my perspective of the system was based on pessimism because to date in the developed world, globally, we have 2 approaches to an individual that openly expresses being suicidal as a clinical professional. So I consider this term suicide management, right? So now I have an individual who's said, hey, Chris, I'm suicidal, or I want to kill myself, or I want to kill someone else. Whether it's a media post, whether it's, you know, a referral from a teacher, law enforcement, an ER doctor, a neighbor, anything, we show up on the scene. And at that moment in time, I make a determination on whether or not this individual's rights need to be removed from them and they need to be taken to a hospital. The thing that irked me the most was there was no standard. So there are multiple scales out there. They're used eclectically. They're implemented widely across school districts, hospitals, but there's no universal standard. And I understand that from a perspective from the academic model that 20 years ago, we didn't have technology. And so we would isolate a study on a certain population and we would find indifferences in demographics, ethnicity, age, gender, culture, background. And so those were variances in the data set that would suggest we cannot standardize a screening model. So I know that's a little academic jargon, but it's rational to think that we can't ask you and you and you all the same questions to determine if you're at a safe, you know, what safety concern you are for suicide and what safety concern you are. But it is my fundamental belief that we have now reached a time where technology's role in utilizing that approach will fast pace us to a point where we will actually be able to understand suicide better by standardizing the screening methodology, because we can now use data and data analytics and deep learning, artificial intelligence, right, buzzword. We will likely see a backlash. We'll still see suicide rates increase if we standardize this model. But what I believe we will do is we will hyperspeed the traditional research model to understanding age, ethnicity, gender, the demographic location of people, and start understanding trends at a much faster rate. So as we formed the company and as we started building the product, we have a minimal viable product out now. We could not get any acceptances from academic institutions. We could not get insurance companies to fund us to support our organization. So in the event of a liability issue. And so I decided to single-handedly step out, use my own money to build it, and go for it. And so the concept here is that we want to build, much to what you were speaking to, where all of the data gets centralized and everybody starts using a standardized screening model. And that data comes back into a centralized location and they use predictive analytics to then pump out information to geographical locations, to entities, to schools, etc. That's the big play, right? That's the overall end goal. The component behind the development for me was in my time working mobile suicide response is that the average person, even the medical professionals and the mental health professionals, use different assessment tools. But the moms, the dads, the cousins, the friends, the brothers, the sisters, nobody knew what to ask. Nobody knew how to approach the topic. And then take it another level, somebody who may say, oh, I know to ask them, hey, are you suicidal? Are you feeling like killing yourself? Do you have access to a gun? Oh shit, what do I do now? So with a 5th grade level reading and writing capacity, we've created the first product that says, ask these questions. It'll aggregate the data, and then it will say what safety concern you're at, and then it'll give you a 3-step response. And that 3-step response, then you can click a button, immediately you're linked to crisis text. You could click a button, you're on suicide hotline. You can click a button, you can find resources within a 10-mile radius of your location. The tech's real quirky, right? Anybody who's a techie person, I don't write code, I'm an architect, so it's, you know, it has its quirks, but it's this trial point now where I think we're at this pinnacle where traditional research meets the fast pace of technology, and we truly don't know what the outcome will be until we test it. And so we decided we would test it and see what we come up with at maybe great risk to our society or our civilization, but at the same time, we have to evolve. So, bless you. So sorry that was a quick synopsis of everything. I'm happy to answer a couple questions if there's any, or we could chit chat afterwards. I truly appreciate everybody here and everybody that's talked today. I don't know if it's an LA thing or not, but I really feel like I'm around a bunch of smart people today. It kind of reminds me, it reminds me of like being in college again, where the discussion's very healthy. So thank you for allowing me to rant, and I appreciate all of you, and looking forward to the rest of the day. It's called the Suicide Prevention App. Oh, yeah. The tracking device.
It feels that way. All right, so we are just going to have Matt Soeth come up here. You're doing a, Matt, are you ready? Or you're texting your notes here? So yeah, Matt's just going to come on up in camera view right here and just give a little intro for yourself and your work. And what we're going to do is start breaking into the small kind of group sessions, and then maybe give people like 5 minutes to kind of wrap up conversations, finish their food and everything. I'll give you this mic too. Yeah.
This could be the coolest mic I've ever used. Yeah, so my name is Matt Soeth. I'm a co-founder of I Can Help. My co-founder Kim, who's over here, we're both educators. And we started this nonprofit when we actually had some issues around our students and just really looking for some kind of practical ways to empower them, give them tools like, here's what you can do about it, right? Because we had a lot of kids, they wanted to help, they just weren't sure how. For today's activity, we do have a pretty diverse group. There's been some amazing conversations. We have experts from all different levels, from research to industry to education. And so the goal of this activity, I want to preface a little bit. So number one, who are my people in here who stream shows on TV? I'm just curious. How many of you who stream shows on TV look ahead at show descriptions to try and figure out what's going on? Stop it now. Okay. How many, anyone here is self-declared like type A personality, like go-getter, entrepreneur, I will do this? You may get in trouble only because you're going to want to read ahead. I encourage you not to. Okay, the goal of this activity, having done this, I know it's very common in industry to kind of do like work through solutions. It's not as common in education outside of the fire drill, which you all remember doing at some point, right? Bell goes off, line up, teacher grabs a folder, takes roll, you're in a straight line, you all get candy, yay, we're alive. What the goal of this activity is to walk you through a scenario. So the first page is going to give you information. So you are the school official, industry official, whatever your role is, whatever that capacity, is to look at the information given and be able to either quickly research or deduce all of the facts you can get just based on the information provided. Okay, and then after a certain amount of time, you guys will talk about it in your group and what you're going to work out and how you would approach this problem, who would you need to contact, what resources are available, who can you get involved based upon your network that you can reach out to, as well as utilizing resources in your group. Thumbs up, good so far? Okay, then you'll get additional information for kind of a round 2, and then part 3 is creating deliverables, right? It may be an action plan, it could be a response plan, it could be stuff you would post online, it could be follow-up pieces, things like that. Okay, with the goal being at the end of this is you want to create something actionable, something that you've worked together, something you've created, something that if this were to ever happen again, you would kind of know the appropriate steps to take. If you've ever done a murder mystery dinner or any type of role playing, like if you approach it like that, this could be a lot of fun. Do not be afraid to get into character. Get down with your bad self. If you brought a monocle, I don't know why you would have one, put it on, make it work. Okay. So on your forms, and mine are downstairs. Everyone has your forms on you. There is a sheet that has, do you have it over there? With all your names on the front groups. Awesome sauce, Exhibit A. So please take a look and find your name. We didn't designate where people are meeting, did we?
No. So yeah, a couple of big things. When Matt's finished, we'll take 5 minutes, finish up. If the trash gets too full, don't worry, we'll get a bag and through the table. Use the restroom. Go down, look at your packets, find your breakout group. We haven't designated spaces. We have not designated spaces, but we should be able to do 2 to 3 groups downstairs and 2 to 3 up here. We should do 1 in this back room, probably 2 here. So just choose whoever gets their first ticket space. Try to stay within the time guidelines. Some of us will be circulating around within it. Because I have now learned that we have a real deadline at 5 p.m. They're picking up, like half of these chairs are dropped off. So yeah, so we're great, we're good on time, but these can be fun and intriguing. You can go for hours. So we'll kind of remind you. Do you want to say anything about the reporting back, maybe? So
yes. So logistically, number 1, designate a group facilitator. Right? We have enough professionals in this room. I feel like we're overqualified for this part. But designate a group facilitator. Designate a recorder. Have someone in your group who's going to take track of all the notes. They may or may not have the best handwriting and the best spelling. We're not grading on that part, so don't freak out. But someone who keep track of the conversation, and then designate a speaker. When you get to the end, one person in your group who's going to report out, answer questions, kind of act on your group's behalf at the end. And then the other piece of that is we kind of break out, just to keep it simple. How about we do groups 1, 2, and 3 downstairs? Group 4, 5, and 6 up here. And then we can do, I mean, even, sorry, it's my teacher self, but like group 4, 5, and 6, and the same thing in the downstairs room, group 1, 2, and 3, towards the back. 3, you get the couches. You're welcome. Thank me later. Any questions? Okay, thank you all.
6 minutes.
6 minutes.
Are these compost? I don't think they were.
No, recycling maybe.
No.
No,
Right when you said that.
no judgment. You're from Oregon. You should know better.
I know.
Oh. It's funny you said you like being back here better.
Right? I don't know.
As soon as I stopped, everyone broke out. I'm like, oh, I'm stuck in the kitchen, right? It's good. No, I love your story. It's so, I'm always fascinated by how people come to their moment, so to speak, on something that, going from this is important to, oh, let's do something.
Yeah, it was, it still is challenging, but there's this overwhelming feeling of like, I'm going to die one day. Regardless. So,
no, again,
I'd love to just shake down and be like, everything was what he built. That was great. So, and the only way to really do it is to go for it. So that was that. I've always had it in me, and I've always been waiting and looking for it. And then one day I'm like, oh, I guess I got the suicide card. Not bad. So I can help. Tell me about it.
So we got started when students created a fake Facebook page about a teacher, over 1,000 followers, a lot of drama. 2 weeks later, kid found out who made it, turned the person in, page is down. A year later, someone made a fake Instagram page about the same teacher. This time we had 30 students go online, comment, and supported the teacher. Page was down in less than 45 minutes. And so since then, we've actually gotten around 800 pages removed off social media sites with harassment, cyberbullying, impersonation, you name it. Where really it's just kids identifying something, hey, we know this isn't right. commenting, using our hashtag, reporting, and getting stuff taken down.
So that's how you guys track the hashtag boom, and that goes into the loop. That goes into that's smart.
So just trying to keep.
That's probably how most of the tagging.
That's quite a bit. And the hashtag's cool too. It's like a bat signal. So even if we can capture it right away, it's the idea that people see that and they're like, oh, I know. Yeah. And so it becomes that sort of, I don't know, unofficial support of if I post this and use this, someone will see it. And, you know, people will help me stand up to this.
Do you blanket or you pocket it where your services are kind of providing that? My wife's a teacher. She's Jewish, and there was this time years ago where there was like Nazi signs getting, swastikas getting spray painted on the school, and it's like, this tomato. Yeah. I'm like, whoa, this is getting out of hand.